there are wars that the world remembers loudly. In monuments, in marches, in the sharp flicker of newsreel footage. And then there are the wars that happened in silence, behind wire fences, inside camps that had no names on Allied maps, in the bodies of men who came home and said almost nothing for the rest of their lives about what they had seen. This is a documentary about that silence. More than 140,000 Allied military personnel were taken prisoner by Imperial Japan during the Second World War. They were held across a network of more than 500 camps, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the coal mines of northern Japan, from the rubber plantations of Malaya to the wind-scraped docks of Yokohama. Some camps held tens of thousands of men, some held fewer than 10. The distance between them, measured not in kilometers but in cruelty, was vast and inconsistent, which is part of what makes this history so difficult to hold in a single thought. The death rate among Western prisoners held by Japan was 27.1%, 7 times higher than the death rate of Allied POWs under German and Italian forces in Europe. That single statistic, recorded at the 1946 Tokyo Tribunal, has sat inside the historical record for 80 years, largely unread by people who were not already looking for it. Tonight, we are going to read it together. We are going to follow the men who lived inside that number and the ones who did not come out. If you are watching this to sleep, welcome. You are in the right place. The narration is slow, measured, and deliberate. But be warned, this is not a sanitized history. It is an honest one. We will not linger on suffering for its own sake, but we will name what happened in the order it happened, with the precision that the people who endured it deserve. They kept diaries in the dark. They scratched records into tin and wood. The least we can do is read those records carefully. So settle in. The lights are low. The world outside is quiet. And somewhere in the Pacific, 80 years ago, a story is beginning that most history textbooks gave less than a paragraph. Chapter 1. The Empire at its Zenith. Japan before the camps. To understand how so many men ended up inside Japanese prison camps, you need to understand the world that created Imperial Japan. Not as a monolith of pure aggression, but as a nation that had, by the early 20th century, experienced a collision of old warrior culture and explosive modern industrialization, so fast and so total that it produced something genuinely unprecedented in human history. Japan had gone from a feudal island society to a naval power capable of defeating Tsarist Russia in 1905 within the span of a single generation. That speed of transformation left certain things behind, particularly any sustained national debate about how a modern state was supposed to treat prisoners of war. The concept at the center of the Japanese military code was Bushido, the way of the warrior. But by the 1930s, the version being taught in military academies bore only a surface resemblance to its historical roots. What it had become, in practical terms, was a doctrine that treated to surrender as the deepest form of personal failure. A Japanese soldier was expected to die before allowing himself to be captured. This was not merely a matter of military preference. It was taught as a moral imperative, reinforced at every level of military training. The consequence of this belief, when applied to enemy prisoners, was a contempt so deep it was barely conscious. These men had surrendered, which meant, by the logic of the code, that they had already ceased to exist as human beings, deserving of serious consideration. Historians have debated at length whether the treatment of Allied POWs was the result of policy, of indifference, or of individual cruelty operating inside a system that permitted it. The evidence, examined honestly, suggests it was all three, in different proportions at different times and in different camps. There was no single master directive ordering systematic mistreatment the way certain other Second World War crimes were centrally organized. What there was, instead, was a structure that normalized indifference and left cruelty largely unpunished. The International Committee of the Red Cross tried to operate in this space. Japan had never ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention. In 1942, facing international pressure, Japanese authorities agreed to abide by its principles. They did not uphold that agreement. The military expansion that would eventually fill those camps with prisoners began in earnest with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. By the late 1930s, Japan was engaged in a grinding, brutal conflict in China, a conflict that many Western governments watched with alarm but limited direct intervention. The army that emerged from years of fighting in China was a hardened force that had developed habits of institutional violence that would follow it into the Pacific. When Japan formally entered the wider World War with the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, those habits came with it. What is less often discussed, and what matters enormously for understanding the camps, is the logistical picture that Imperial Japan was operating inside. The empire had expanded so rapidly across such enormous geographic distances that it faced a genuine structural problem with prisoner management. From virtually the first week of the Pacific War, they had not planned adequately for the hundreds of thousands of prisoners their initial victories would generate. There were no established supply chains for feeding prisoners, no standardized rules, and no bureaucratic culture of oversight. Into that vacuum, individual camp commandants exercised enormous autonomous power. Some used it humanely. A meaningful number did not. Japan entered the Pacific War in the final months of 1941 believing, with some justification given recent events, that Western colonial armies in Asia would not put up prolonged resistance. The speed of British withdrawal through Malaya, the fall of Hong Kong on Christmas Day of 1941, and the early confusion of Allied responses in the Philippines all seemed to confirm this belief. What no Japanese strategic planner had fully accounted for was what happens when you are suddenly responsible for feeding, housing, and administering hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners across a theatre of war, spanning millions of square kilometers of jungle, ocean, and mountain terrain. By the spring of 1942, that problem was enormous. By the winter of 1942, it had become catastrophic. There is a school of thought in the historiography represented most thoroughly in works like Gavan Dor's Prisoners of the Japanese, published in 1994, that the camps cannot be understood through a single explanatory framework. Dawes spent years interviewing survivors, and what he found was a profound diversity of experience that resists easy summary. Some men were treated with relative decency by individual guards. Some guards were sadists who operated without any restraint. Most experiences fell somewhere in between, shaped by geography, by the identity of the commandant, by the economic utility of the prisoners at any given moment, and by the state of the war itself. As Japan began to lose, conditions in most camps deteriorated sharply for a reason as simple and brutal as it was inevitable. There was less food available, and the guards were frightened, and frightened men with absolute power over people they do not consider fully human are among the most dangerous forces in recorded history. The camps did not begin in a single moment. They grew, sprawled, and shifted across the Pacific over nearly 4 years. To follow them properly, we need to start at the beginning. with the shock of the first great Allied defeats and the men who walked out of those defeats into captivity. We need to start in the Philippines, in the first months of 1942, at the southern end of a peninsula called Bataan, because that is where the story of the camps, the true, documented, human story, begins to acquire a face. The Japanese Imperial Military, at its height in the spring of 1942, controlled a territory stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the border of India in the west, and from the coast of China to the mid-Pacific. It was a staggering geographic achievement, assembled in less than 6 months of warfare. Managing that achievement, and managing the hundreds of thousands of prisoners it produced, was a problem the Empire was structurally unprepared to solve. The men who would pay for that failure were already in place. They were tired, hungry, ill, and they were about to begin marching. Chapter 2: The Fall of Bataan. How 100,000 men became prisoners. The Bataan Peninsula juts southward from the main island of Luzon in the Philippines like a finger, pointing into Manila Bay. It is roughly 50 kilometers long, covered in dense tropical jungle, bisected by mountain ridges, and, in April of 1942, it was the last major defensive position in the Philippines, still held by Allied forces. The men inside it had been fighting for nearly 4 months with inadequate supplies, limited air cover, and no realistic prospect of relief. They knew reinforcements were not coming. General Douglas MacArthur had already been ordered to Australia. The men of Bataan, American and Filipino soldiers together, had been holding a shrinking perimeter on half rations since January of 1942, and by the time the final Japanese offensive began in earnest, many were so weakened by malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition that they could barely stand. The formal surrender came on the 9th of April, 1942. Approximately 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers laid down their arms. The largest surrender of forces under United States command in American military history. General Edward King made the decision to surrender despite having no guarantee of how his men would be treated. He asked the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, whether his troops would be treated as prisoners of war under accepted conventions. The answer he received was non-committal. The answer his men were about to receive, over the following days, was written in exhaustion, thirst, and the dust of a Philippine road. The Japanese had not planned for this many prisoners. Their intelligence estimates had projected far fewer survivors. They expected Allied forces to fight until the force was largely destroyed before any surrender came. Instead, they now held somewhere between 76,000 and 78,000 prisoners, depending on which accounting you use, and they had neither the transport nor the food reserves to manage them. The decision was made to march the prisoners north, roughly 100 kilometers, to a former Philippine Army training facility called Camp O'Donnell, which had been designated as an internment center. It was a decision made in a logistical vacuum. Nobody on the Japanese side had worked out how long the march would take, how much water would be available along the route, or what conditions at the destination were actually like. The march began on approximately the 10th of April, 1942. Groups of prisoners were assembled at Mariveles, at the southern tip of the peninsula, and sent north along roads that were simultaneously being used by Japanese military traffic moving southward. The tropical heat on the lowland roads was staggering. Men who had already been starved for months were given almost no food during the march, and in many stretches were denied access to water, even when wells or streams were visible from the road. The distance they were forced to cover each day varied. Some groups marched longer stretches under more aggressive guards. Others covered shorter distances, but waited for days in holding areas without shade or shelter. The duration of the march ranged from 5 to 10 days, depending on when a prisoner entered the column and which route his group was assigned. The behavior of Japanese guards during the march was not uniform, and this is an important detail that the historical record consistently supports. Some guards distributed water, some facilitated rests. But the systematic pattern, the one recorded in hundreds of survivor testimonies collected after the war, was of casual, authorized brutality directed at men who were too weak to resist. Prisoners who fell behind the column were executed at the roadside. Men who stopped to drink from puddles or irrigation ditches were beaten. Filipino civilians who attempted to hand food or water to the passing prisoners risked being shot alongside them. The Japanese guards had been told that these men were cowards for surrendering. The institutional contempt translated directly into individual acts. What makes the Bataan Death March uniquely significant in the history of Pacific War POW experiences, beyond its immediate human cost, is that it established, in the first months of the Pacific War, a pattern of institutional failure that would persist for the next 3.5 years. There was no accountability. There were no consequences for guards who killed prisoners for falling behind. The structure of the march was set at a level above the individual guard. The inadequate food, the absent medical care, the refusal to provide transport for the seriously ill, and those structural decisions were made by men who were never adequately called to account while the war was in progress. The march was a preview of the camps, and the camps were a preview of the broader machinery of forced labor that the Japanese Empire was about to assemble across Southeast Asia. Only approximately 54,000 prisoners reached Camp O'Donnell. The shortfall between that number and the approximately 76,000 who began the march represents men who died on the road, men who escaped into the jungle, and men who were killed by guards or collapsed and were left behind. The estimates of deaths during the march itself vary. The range in different historical sources runs from roughly 3,000 to 10,000, with the diversity reflecting genuine uncertainty about documentation in chaotic conditions rather than any single agreed figure. What is not in dispute is what Camp O'Donnell looked like when the survivors arrived. Camp O'Donnell in April of 1942 was a facility designed, at best, for a fraction of the number of men now arriving inside its wire. There was one functioning water spigot for the American prisoners, and a small number for the Filipino section. Latrines were inadequate for the population. Medical supplies were negligible. The Japanese commandant, a colonel whose survivors later recalled as making a speech on arrival that made clear he viewed the prisoners with profound contempt, set a tone for the camp that would not improve. Men were dying at rates that alarmed even the camp's own internal record keepers. The Filipino prisoners, who were interned separately and in even worse conditions, were dying faster. In the weeks immediately following the march, hundreds of men were being buried each day. The scale of what was happening at Camp O'Donnell attracted enough attention that the Japanese authorities eventually made the decision to relocate many of the prisoners. By late June of 1942, most of the American prisoners were moved north to a larger facility at Cabanatuan, where conditions, while still severe, were marginally more stable. The Filipino prisoners were eventually released. A pragmatic calculation about the cost of maintaining so many of them, though release into a war-occupied country with no means of support was its own kind of sentence. The men who remained in Japanese captivity across the Philippines would spend The next 3 years navigating a system that would periodically move them, put them to work, feed them barely enough to function, and occasionally kill them for infractions, real or perceived. The Philippines would become one of the most documented theaters of Pacific War POW experience, in large part because so many American prisoners passed through it, and because American military authorities, after the war, invested heavily in collecting testimony. The personal accounts that survive, held in archives at the National Archives in Washington, at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, and in collections at universities across the American Southwest, form one of the most extensive records of captivity in 20th century military history. What those accounts share, across hundreds of individual voices, is a particular kind of careful, deliberate observation. Men in extreme circumstances tend to remember in extraordinary detail. They counted calories, they recorded names, they noted dates. They were determined, in some way that seems to have been almost instinctive, that what was happening to them would not go unwitnessed. Chapter 3: The Fall of Singapore, the British Empire's most humiliating hour. 7 weeks before the surrender at Bataan, on the 15th of February 1942, something happened in Southeast Asia that shocked the British Empire more profoundly than any single event since the beginning of the war. The island fortress of Singapore, billed for years as the Gibraltar of the East, the linchpin of British power in Asia, a symbol of imperial permanence, surrendered to Japanese forces after just over a week of fighting on the island itself. Approximately 97,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers became prisoners of war in a single afternoon. The Japanese forces that had taken them prisoner numbered roughly 30,000. Singapore had fallen not because the defenders were outnumbered, but because the mechanisms of imperial confidence had rendered its commanders incapable of the kind of flexible, adaptive response the situation demanded. The story of Singapore's fall is, in significant part, a story about assumptions. The British military planners, who had designed the island's defences, had built them against a naval assault from the south. The heavy coastal guns pointed seaward. The Japanese came from the north, down through the Malay Peninsula on bicycles, using roads the British had built. Moving faster than any Japanese advance in the region was supposed to be possible. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commanding British forces, found himself in command of a larger force that was outmaneuvered, outpaced, and in the final phase, cut off from its primary water supply. The decision to surrender, made on the 15th of February, 1942, was militarily rational and personally devastating. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. The immediate post-surrender period saw over 15,000 Australian and approximately 35,000 British prisoners herded into the Changi area at the eastern end of Singapore Island. Changi, the former Selarang Barracks, a British military installation of some considerable size, became the administrative centre of what would eventually be the largest single POW complex maintained by Japan. It spread across roughly 16 square kilometres of coastal hills, incorporating the barracks buildings, the prison building that would give the camp its most enduring name, and a surrounding landscape of roads and wire. In its early weeks, the camp was managed largely by British and Australian officers, with Japanese forces exercising oversight from a distance. Conditions were difficult, but, relative to what many of these same men would later experience, manageable. The historiography of Changi is worth pausing on, because it has generated more revisionist argument than almost any other Pacific War POW site. For decades after the war, Changi was represented in popular culture, in Australian war films, in British memoirs, in newspaper retrospectives, as a place of systematic brutality, comparable to the worst of the Japanese camp system. More recent scholarship, drawing on detailed camp records and the accounts of men who spent extended time there, has substantially revised this picture. Changshi, the historical consensus now holds, was comparatively benign, not comfortable, not adequately supplied, not a place where men were treated with dignity, but a place where the internal organisation maintained by British and Australian officers created a functioning community structure that buffered some of the worst possibilities. Men organised schools. They ran workshops. They put on theatrical performances. This was not complacency. It was a form of active psychological resistance that the historiography has only recently given its proper weight. But Changi was, for most of the men who passed through it, a transit point rather than a final destination. The majority of Singapore's POW Jews spent some time at Changi before being shipped out to Thailand and Burma to work on the railway that we will discuss at length in the chapters ahead, to Borneo to build airstrips in conditions of exceptional hardship, to Taiwan to work in copper mines, to Japan itself, where they would labor in factories, shipyards, and coal mines under the direct supervision of Japanese civilian foremen. The departure of work parties from Changi became a rhythm of camp life, a steady hemorrhage of men, from the relative stability of the main camp into conditions that were, in almost every case, significantly worse. The Australian prisoners form a particular thread in the Singapore story. More than 15,000 Australians were captured in the fall of Malaya and Singapore, and they arrived at Changi carrying a specific weight. The knowledge that their country had been arguing for years about whether commitments in Europe were drawing resources away from the defense of the Pacific. The fall of Singapore, arriving just days after Japanese forces launched air raids on Darwin in northern Australia, felt to many Australians less like a military reversal than like an existential threat to the nation itself. The men inside Changi's wire knew, through the fragments of information that percolated into any POW camp, that the map of the Pacific had changed fundamentally. They did not know when or whether it would change back. The Indian Army prisoners at Singapore represent a chapter of this history that has received significantly less attention in English language scholarship than it deserves. More than 25,000 Indian soldiers were captured, and they faced a specific pressure that the British and Australian prisoners did not. Organised Japanese efforts to recruit them into the Indian National Army, a force being raised under Subhas Chandra Bose to fight against the British for Indian independence. The pressure was, in some camps, intense. Indian prisoners who refused to join faced conditions that were materially worse than those available to men who agreed. This created a moral landscape of almost impossible complexity. Men who joined the Indian National Army were, from one angle, collaborators. From another angle, they were responding to coercion, and many harbored nationalist beliefs about Indian independence that were entirely legitimate, regardless of the context in which they were being exploited. Post-war prosecutions of Indian National Army members were eventually abandoned, in part because the British government recognised the political impossibility of trying men whose underlying cause, independence, had already been conceded. The civilians of Singapore and Malaya also entered captivity in February of 1942. European civilian men, women, and children were interned in a series of camps across the island. and the peninsula, with women and children separated from men. The women's camps, Sime Road, Changi Jail's civilian section, held extraordinary collections of individuals: teachers, nurses, plantation managers' wives, missionaries, colonial administrators' families. The accounts that survive from these civilian internment camps, several published in the decades after the war, others sitting in private family collections, describe communities organizing themselves against entropy, maintaining schools for the children, bartering with guards for medicines, recording deaths in careful registers. The children who passed through these camps and survived are, by the third decade of the 21st century, very old. Some have given interviews. Their accounts have a particular quality: the clarity of memories formed in childhood, carrying details that adult memory might have smoothed away. The fall of Singapore created, in a matter of weeks, a prisoner population that the Japanese Empire had neither the infrastructure nor the intention to adequately sustain. The decision that would most immediately determine the fate of tens of thousands of these men had already been made in Tokyo by the spring of 1942, though the men at Changi did not yet know it. Imperial Japan needed a railway. It needed it built quickly through terrain that would require enormous human labor to cross. And the prisoners of Changi, along with hundreds of thousands of conscripted Asian laborers who have received far less historical attention, were about to provide it. Chapter 4: The Railway of Death. Burma, Thailand, and the cost of strategically necessary infrastructure. In the winter of 1941, the Japanese military had a problem that was purely logistical, and that military logic would translate into human catastrophe on a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend. Having conquered most of Southeast Asia with extraordinary speed, Japan's armies in Burma were fighting the British with one critical vulnerability. Their supply lines ran by sea from Singapore northward along the coast to Rangoon, and those sea lanes were increasingly exposed to Allied submarine and air attack. The solution that Japanese military planners settled on was a railway: 420 kilometers of track through the mountains and jungle of western Thailand and eastern Burma, connecting Ban Pong in Thailand to Thanbusayat in Burma, that would provide a secure overland supply route for operations in Burma and potentially for a projected offensive into India. The project was not, in engineering terms, an impossible one. Surveys had been done on similar routes by British engineers in the 1930s, who concluded that a railway was buildable, but would require several years of systematic construction under reasonable working conditions. The Japanese decided to build it in approximately 18 months using forced labor, Allied prisoners of war, and a much larger force of conscripted Asian workers, predominantly from Malaya, Burma, and what is now Indonesia, referred to in the historical record by the Malay term Romusha. The Romusha workers are the true forgotten of this history. They vastly outnumbered the Allied prisoners on the railway. Their death rates were far higher, and their story was documented far less thoroughly, because most of them came from communities without the institutional literacy culture that produced the diaries and registers that Allied POWs left. Behind the Allied prisoner workforce on the Burma-Thailand Railway numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 61,000 men. The majority were British, Australian, Dutch, and American. They were transported to the work sites in conditions that set the tone for what followed, crammed into steel boxcars in tropical heat, given minimal food and water, arriving at jungle campsites that were frequently no more than clearings with bamboo-framed shelters. Work gangs were organised around specific sections of the railway route, with different sections allocated to different national groups. The Australian prisoners were concentrated primarily in the Thai section of the railway. The British and Dutch worked across both the Thai and Burmese sections. American prisoners, fewer in number, worked primarily on the Thai section. The work itself consisted primarily of clearing jungle, grading embankments, cutting through rock faces, and laying track. In sections where the railway crossed rivers or ravines, wooden trestle bridges were constructed. Enormous structures built without the benefit of modern machinery, using hand tools, bamboo scaffolding, and labour organised on principles of exhaustion. The most notorious single feature of the entire railway was a cutting through a solid rock ridge known as Konyu cutting, which became known among the prisoners and subsequently in history as Hellfire Pass. The name came from the appearance of the site at night, when torchlit work gangs cutting rock by hand through 18-hour shifts, illuminated by fire and moving through clouds of dust, created a scene that survivors consistently described in terms that reached for the infernal. Hellfire Pass cost approximately 700 Allied lives, according to Australian Department of Veterans Affairs documentation. The cutting itself still exists. It is now a memorial and museum site, maintained by the Australian government. The acceleration of the construction schedule in the second half of 1943, the period the prisoners called Speedo, represents the point at which the railway construction crossed from severe to catastrophic. Japanese engineers, under pressure from Tokyo to complete the line before the monsoon ended, began pushing the work rate past the absolute physiological limits of a workforce that was already severely malnourished and disease-ridden. Cholera, introduced to the camps by contaminated water sources, swept through both the prisoner and Romusha populations with devastating speed. Dysentery was endemic. Malaria was near universal. The prisoners working the railway were receiving caloric allocations insufficient for sedentary survival while performing heavy manual labour for 12 or more hours a day in tropical heat. The doctors among the POW population, and there were many, including some who became remarkable figures in the history of medicine under constraint, documented the deterioration in their patients with a precision that must have required enormous psychological endurance. The railway was completed in October of 1943, when tracks laid from the Thai end and from the Burmese end met at a point in the mountains. The ceremony marking the joining of the tracks exists in contemporary Japanese photographs. The human cost of that ceremony, set against those photographs, is a particular kind of historical contrast that needs no elaboration. More than 12,500 Allied prisoners died during the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway. The death rate among Allied prisoners working on the railway was roughly 1 in 5. The Romusha workers died at approximately double that rate, and the total Romusha death toll, while not documented with the same precision as the Allied figures, is estimated by historians at somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 individuals. They were mostly young men from rural communities in Southeast Asia who had been promised wages and fair treatment and received neither. Among the Australians who would write the most extensive post-war literature about the railway, the numbers are specific enough to carry the weight of individual lives. Approximately 13,000 Australian prisoners worked on the Burma-Thailand Railway. 2,700 of them did not return home. Roughly 1 in 5 Australian men on the railway died during its construction. The Australian experience of the railway is now embedded in the national memory through a literature, a museum, a range of scholarly works, and an annual commemorative tradition that has given the railway a specific place in Australian historical consciousness that has no precise equivalent in British or American collective memory, despite the similar proportional losses those nationalities suffered. The experience of the railway has generated a specific historiographical question that the literature has never fully resolved. To what extent were the deaths the result of deliberate policy? And to what extent were they the result of structural indifference, combined with an impossible construction schedule? The evidence points firmly toward the latter. There was no central directive ordering the deaths of railway workers. What there was instead was a construction imperative that was prioritized above all other considerations, including the survival of the labor force, and a camp structure in which individual guards and commandants had enormous autonomous power over men who had no recourse. The result was mass death without a single clear order producing it, which is one reason why post-war legal proceedings against those responsible were complicated, partial, and ultimately inadequate. The railway began carrying supplies in late 1943. It operated for less than 2 years before Allied air attacks began systematically destroying the bridges and track. The military value Japan ultimately extracted from the railway, measured against the human cost of building it, was, by any rational calculation, minimal. The bridges at the River Kwai, the most famous single structure on the line, were destroyed by Allied bombing multiple times. The railway that cost more than 12,500 Allied lives and an estimated 100,000 Romusha lives was operationally marginal almost from the day it opened. That gap between cost and utility is one of the more quietly devastating facts in Pacific War history, and it has been sitting in the archives for 80 years. Chapter 5. The Hell Ships. When the ocean became the danger. There is a category of Second World War maritime disaster that appears in no Allied official memorial, that is marked by no dedicated monument in most countries, and that the families of victims sometimes spent decades being unable to explain to others, because the explanation required an account of circumstances so specific and so terrible that it resisted compression into ordinary conversation. These were the sinkings of unmarked Japanese transport ships, carrying Allied prisoners of war through waters where Allied submarines and aircraft operated freely, hunting Japanese shipping, unaware of the human cargo below the waterlines. The ships became known, in the literature and in the memory of survivors, as hell ships, a term that captures something accurate about the experience of traveling inside them even when they reached their destinations. These were cargo vessels, freighters, tankers, repurposed to carry human beings in holds designed for coal, rice, or military equipment. Men were packed into these spaces in numbers that made the air itself a threat within hours of departure. Hundreds of men in a hold designed for 50. The heat in the metal holds of a ship crossing tropical waters in the mid-1940s, with no ventilation and minimal water supply, was capable of killing men within the first day. Men who arrived at the holds, already weakened by months of POW camp conditions, had even less physiological reserve to draw on. Japan's practice of using these vessels to transport prisoners was not, in itself, violation of any convention that Japan had accepted, but the decision not to mark these ships with any indication of their human cargo was a direct violation of international norms that Japan had acknowledged. Allied submarines and aircraft were targeting Japanese shipping with sophisticated and increasingly effective methods by 1943 and 1944. The ships carrying prisoners moved with convoys of military supply vessels and tankers. They flew no markings that identified them as carrying POWs. When an Allied submarine or aircraft identified a Japanese convoy, the prisoners in those holds were invisible. The sinkings that resulted from this combination of factors produced some of the largest single incident loss of life among Allied POW populations in the entire Pacific War. Approximately 11,000 Allied prisoners died when ships carrying them were sunk by Allied forces. American submarines and aircraft that had no knowledge of the prisoners aboard. The figure is not in serious historical dispute, though the precise number varies by a few hundred, depending on the source and accounting method. It was recorded at the Tokyo Tribunal. It is one of the most uncomfortable facts in Pacific War history. Allied forces, operating entirely appropriately against legitimate military targets, killed thousands of their own people because the Japanese refused to identify the ships as prisoner transports. The sinking of the Junyo Maru off the coast of Sumatra on the 18th of September 1944 produced a loss of life that, had it involved any other category of vessel, would be among the most remembered maritime disasters of the 20th century. The ship was carrying approximately 2,300 Allied prisoners and somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 Romusha workers to labour sites in Sumatra. A British submarine, HMS Tradewind, was operating in those waters on a normal anti-shipping patrol. It identified the Junyo Maru as a legitimate military transport target. The torpedoes that struck the ship killed approximately 5,600 people in total, Allied prisoners and Romusha combined. Fewer than 700 survived. It was, by most measures, the deadliest single sinking of any vessel in the Second World War. And most people who are not specifically interested in Pacific War history have never heard of it. The Oryoku Maru, sinking in December of 1944, has a different character in the historical record, one defined by the fact that American aircraft were responsible and that the victims were primarily American prisoners of war. The Oryoku Maru departed Manila Bay on the 13th of December 1944, carrying approximately 1,600 American military prisoners from camps in the Philippines. American Navy aircraft, operating without knowledge of the ship's cargo, attacked it in Subic Bay the following morning. The ship was badly damaged and run aground. The prisoners who survived the initial attack were held on the ship and on the beach for days before being transferred to other vessels, which were subsequently also attacked. Of the approximately 1,600 men who departed Manila in December, fewer than 450 reached Japan. The remainder died at sea, on beaches, in subsequent sinkings, and from the conditions of the journey. For the families of men who died on the hell ships, the post-war decades carried a specific cruelty. Many families were told that their son or husband had died in the Pacific theatre, a phrase that covered everything from combat to captivity to the interior of a sinking cargo hold. The documentation of individual hell ship sinkings was scattered across Allied naval records, Japanese shipping logs, and the testimony of the comparatively few survivors, and assembling a complete account of any individual ship required research that was beyond the resources of most families. Some families did not learn the specific circumstances of their relative's death until the 1980s or 90s, when researchers began systematically compiling the hellship records that are now more accessible. The Hellship Memorial Society, which maintains a dedicated website and database, represents one of the more recent efforts to make these individual stories findable, a form of historical reparation that matters more than it might seem. The submarines that sank these ships, the men who served on them, who were doing their duty with precision and effectiveness, lived with the knowledge after the war that their actions had killed Allied prisoners. Many submitted or gave testimony in the post-war investigations. The accounts that survive carry a particular weight. Men who had done nothing wrong, who had operated exactly as they were trained to operate, trying to make sense of a consequence that no military training had prepared them for. The Japanese decision not to mark these ships did not remove the operational effectiveness of Allied submarine forces. It simply redirected the dying. The logic of that decision, examined from any angle, is difficult to defend. The Hell ships represent the Pacific War POW experience at its most geometrically cruel. The intersection of Allied military efficiency, Japanese indifference to international norms, and the particular physics of what happens to human beings in a metal hold when explosions begin below the waterline. They are the part of this history that tends to produce, in people encountering it for the first time, a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of boredom or distraction, but the silence of a mind momentarily stopping because the information arriving is genuinely difficult to hold. That silence is appropriate. It is, in some sense, the correct initial response. The research obligation, the obligation that comes after the silence, is to keep going. Chapter 6. The Camps of Japan, Inside the Empire's Industrial Heart. By the final years of the war, Imperial Japan had developed a parallel labor economy running inside its own domestic industrial base, one that most Japanese civilians who lived near its facilities could see, and, to varying degrees, understood, but that was not discussed in polite company, and that the Japanese government never officially acknowledged in the direct terms that would have triggered international consequences. More than 160 prisoner of war slave labor camps existed in Japan itself at the time of surrender. They were attached to factories, shipyards, mines, and construction sites. The prisoners who worked in them were, in the language of Japanese industrial administration, a labor resource, a term that stripped the human content from the fact that these were military officers, doctors, accountants, farmers, and students who had been captured in uniform and transported to a country they had never expected to see. The movement of prisoners to Japan had accelerated as the war turned against the empire. From 1943 onward, as Allied forces began recapturing territory in the Pacific, and as the labor demands of Japanese war production increased, the decision was made at the highest administrative levels to redirect prisoner populations toward domestic industrial sites. Men who had been working on the Burma Railway, in Philippine labor camps, and in the Dutch East Indies were sorted, shipped on Hell ships through progressively more dangerous waters, and delivered to Japanese ports. From there, they were distributed to camps affiliated with specific industrial concerns. The great Zaibatsu companies that formed the spine of Japanese war production, including enterprises that still exist in modified form in the contemporary Japanese economy. The geography of prisoner camps in Japan proper ran from the southern islands of Kyushu, where coal mines demanded continuous labor, northward, through Honshu to the steelworks and shipyards of the industrial cities, and into the northern regions of the main island, where copper mines and other extractive industries operated. The camps were numbered and administered through a military bureaucracy, but in practice, the prisoners spent most of their working hours under the supervision of civilian foremen employed by the industrial companies that had contracted for their labor. The relationship between military administration and civilian employer created a specific dynamic that the post-war war crimes investigations found particularly difficult to address. Civilian foremen who had abused prisoners were largely beyond the reach of military tribunals, and the corporate entities that had benefited from their labor were not, in the post-war settlement framework, treated as liable parties. The conditions inside the Japan camps varied in ways that the historical record documents with considerable specificity. Camps attached to coal mines in Kyushu. Places like the camps at Fukuoka, which served a cluster of nearby mining operations, have produced some of the most thoroughly documented accounts of prisoner experience in Japan. Men worked underground in mines that were, by any reasonable industrial safety standard, extremely dangerous. Mine accidents killed prisoners. The work was physically exhausting beyond the resources of men who were consistently being fed below subsistence level. The caloric allocation in most Japan-based POW camps was roughly 600 calories per day, approximately the level you would prescribe for a sedentary person engaged in a clinical fast, being applied instead to men doing heavy physical labor. The math of that disparity requires no embellishment. The experience of American prisoners in Japan has been documented through a specific archive maintained at the National Archives and the Library of Congress, built primarily from post-war testimony collected by the War Crimes Investigation teams that operated across Japan in the months following surrender. More than 27,000 American military prisoners were held in the Pacific War, spread from Java to Japan itself. The accounts they gave after liberation carry a particular documentary precision, partly because American military culture encouraged formal reporting, partly because many prisoners had been keeping mental records throughout their captivity, aware that the testimony they were holding would eventually be needed. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project contains recordings of some of these testimonies, made decades after the war, in which elderly men describe the mines and the shipyards and the factory floors with a specificity that has not dimmed. The Japanese civilian population near the camps represents a dimension of this history that Japanese scholarship has engaged with more directly in recent decades than Western accounts typically acknowledge. Most Japanese civilians living near POW work sites knew, in broad terms, what was happening. Some facilitated small acts of compassion. Food passed through fence gaps, a guard who looked away. Others participated in the hostility. The cultural constraint on discussing the camps openly in post-war Japan, a constraint driven by a combination of shame, official discouragement during the American occupation, and the political difficulty of confronting specific corporate and military legacies, meant that the domestic Japanese account of the camps took several decades to develop a full public voice. Japanese scholars, journalists, and documentary filmmakers working from the 1980s onward have done significant work in opening that account. The camp at Omori, on a small island in Tokyo Bay, is one of the more documented Japan camps because of the identity of some of its prisoners. American airman Louis Zamperini, whose post-war story became widely known through Laura Hillenbrand's biography and subsequent film adaptation, was held at Omori and at the camp at Naoetsu. Zamperini's account has introduced many people to the Japan camp experience who would not otherwise have encountered it, which is the particular value of biographical history when it is carefully grounded in the larger record. What Zamperini described The arbitrary control exercised by individual guards, the use of physical punishment as a tool of dominance, the management of hope and despair as deliberate instruments, was not exceptional to his camp. It was the broadly normal experience of prisoners in Japan, modulated by the specific personalities of the guards and commandants present. When the first atomic device was used over Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, and the second over Nagasaki 3 days later, there were Allied prisoners of war in the vicinity of both cities. Some prisoners were in camps adjacent to both urban centers. Some died in the immediate aftermath of the detonations. Some survived and carried for the rest of their lives the particular complexity of being simultaneously a victim of Japanese captivity and a survivor of the weapons that ended it. Their accounts, collected in the post-war decades by researchers and journalists, occupy a specific and largely unresolved place in the literature. Men who could not straightforwardly celebrate the bombing because they had been inside its radius, and who could not straightforwardly mourn it because they understood what it had stopped. Japan formally accepted the terms of surrender on the 15th of August, 1945. The official signing ceremony took place on the 2nd of September aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. American former POW Gregory Pappy Boyington and other liberated prisoners were present for the ceremony. The formal end of the war did not mean the immediate liberation of all prisoners. In remote camps in the outer islands, it took weeks for the news to arrive and for liberation teams to reach the men. Some prisoners were liberated by American paratroopers who dropped directly into camp compounds. Others were found by naval teams who came ashore and walked into camps where the guards had already abandoned their posts. The last prisoners liberated from Japanese captivity were freed in conditions of a world that had already, technically, moved on to peace, a peace that would take the rest of their lives to process. Chapter 7. The Dutch East Indies. The Forgotten Colony and its Captured Defenders. There is a geography to the Pacific War's prisoner story that most English-language histories flatten into a handful of dominant narratives. The Philippines, Singapore, the railway, and in doing so, leave entire national experiences almost invisible to the general audience. The Dutch prisoners of the East Indies represent one of the most significant of these omissions. When Japanese forces completed their conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the archipelago that is today the nation of Indonesia, in March of 1942, they captured somewhere between 42,000 and 43,000 Dutch and Dutch colonial military personnel, along with a civilian population of European men, women, and children numbering in the tens of thousands. These prisoners, spread across the vast island chain, from Java to Sumatra to Celebes, entered a captivity that was in most respects as severe as anything recorded elsewhere in the Pacific War, and that produced a death rate among civilian internees, particularly among children, that has only been systematically studied by Dutch and Indonesian scholars in the last 3 decades. The military campaign that produced these prisoners had been extraordinarily swift. The Netherlands had been occupied by Germany since May of 1940, which meant that the Dutch forces defending the East Indies were operating without meaningful resupply, without realistic prospect of metropolitan reinforcement, and with the knowledge that the country fighting for was effectively already lost at its European centre. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, the KNIL from its Dutch initials, was a colonial force of mixed Dutch, Dutch Indonesian, and local composition, trained for internal security, rather than large-scale conventional warfare against a modern army. When Japanese forces landed on Java in late February of 1942. The defense lasted precisely 8 days before the surrender was formalized on the 8th of March. The speed was not a reflection of cowardice or incompetence. It was a reflection of arithmetic. The camps that received the Dutch prisoners in Java ranged from converted civilian buildings in Batavia, now Jakarta, to former Dutch military barracks in Bandung and Surabaya. The initial conditions were, by PW camp standards, relatively organized, largely because the Dutch colonial bureaucracy had left behind a set of physical institutions that could be converted to detention purposes without extensive modification. But organization in the physical sense did not translate into adequate conditions in any human sense. Food allocations were immediately below subsistence. Medical supplies were not provided. The Dutch military doctors, who organized themselves to care for their fellow prisoners, found themselves in the same position as their British and Australian counterparts on the railway, attempting to practice medicine with almost nothing, maintaining meticulous records of deterioration that they knew might eventually serve as evidence, and making triage decisions that no medical training fully prepares a person for. The civilian internment in the Dutch East Indies has a specific quality in the historical record that separates it from the military prisoner experience, and that quality is the presence of children. The colonial Dutch community in Java included large numbers of women and children whose European male relatives had been taken to military camps, leaving the women to be interned separately, in camps that mixed women, children, and elderly men. The children who grew up inside these camps, some of whom entered them as infants, and were liberated as children of 6 or 7, experienced captivity as the primary context of their consciousness during formative years. The memoirs and testimonies that these individuals produced as adults, many in the latter decades of the 20th century, have a particular character. Accounts of a childhood in which the abnormal was the entire known world, written by people trying to translate that experience into terms that people raised outside wire could understand. The Eurasian or Indo-Dutch community in the East Indies faced a specific complexity that the historiography has engaged with carefully. Many members of this community had mixed Dutch and Indonesian ancestry, and Japanese racial categorization placed them in an ambiguous position, sometimes interned with European Dutch prisoners, sometimes not, sometimes treated marginally better, sometimes treated as a distinct category, warranting specific suspicion. The practical consequences of these classifications were matters of survival. Families were sometimes split across classification lines. Men of mixed heritage, who were classified as Dutch military prisoners, were interned with European personnel. Those who were not so classified sometimes remained in the general population, which was its own form of vulnerability, in an occupied territory where the Japanese military had absolute authority, and where Indonesian nationalist groups, some of whom had welcomed the end of Dutch colonial rule, occupied a complicated political position relative to both the occupiers and the occupied. The work assignments that Dutch prisoners received evolved as the war progressed and Japanese labor demands intensified. Java provided a significant contingent of men for the Burma-Thailand Railway. Dutch prisoners formed one of the distinct national groups on the Thai section of the line, and Dutch medical officers among them kept some of the most detailed records of camp conditions and death rates that survived the war. Other Dutch prisoners were shipped to various Pacific locations, to Japanese-controlled territories across the archipelago, to Japan itself, following patterns similar to those used for British and Australian prisoners. The separation of men from their families who remained interned in Java was total and in many cases permanent. Men who died on the railway or in Japan were buried in foreign soil. Their families in the Java camps frequently did not learn of their deaths for years. Post-war commemoration of the Dutch East Indies prisoner experience has been complicated by the political history of Indonesian independence. The Netherlands conceded Indonesian sovereignty in December of 1949, after 4 years of bitter conflict in which the Dutch government attempted to reassert colonial authority over a territory that had experienced Japanese occupation as, among other things, a disruption of European colonial power from which there was no going back. The Dutch veterans of Japanese captivity came home to a country still processing military defeat in Europe, beginning to process the loss of its colonial empire, and not especially equipped to receive the specific testimonies of men and women who had suffered in the East Indies. The Dutch National Memorial Landscape for Second World War Captivity, the Indisch Monument in The Hague, dedicated in 1988, decades after comparable British and Australian memorials, reflects this delayed reckoning. The delay is not a measure of indifference so much as a measure of how much political and psychological ground had to be cleared before the specific grief could find its public form. The Indonesian workers, who were conscripted as Romusha labourers during the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies, occupy the most invisible position in this entire history. Estimates of the number of Indonesian men conscripted for labour service under Japanese occupation range very widely, from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million individuals. And the death rates among them, in the absence of systematic documentation, can only be estimated. What the Indonesian historical record makes clear is that the Japanese occupation of the East Indies was experienced by the Indonesian population, not as liberation from Dutch colonialism, though some nationalist politicians initially hoped it might be, but as the substitution of one form of extraction and control for another, in many respects more violent one. The men who were taken from their villages to build roads, airstrips, and fortifications across the archipelago largely disappear from history at the point of conscription. Their names are not on any memorial. Their deaths are not recorded in any archive that has been made available to historians. They are the numerically largest group of victims in this story, and they are the least visible. The Dutch East Indies chapter of Pacific War prisoner history closes, formally, with the surrender of Japanese forces in the archipelago following the August 1945 announcement, the liberation of civilian camps in Java, carried out by Allied forces and subsequently by British and Australian troops who briefly occupied key areas, produced scenes of physical condition that shocked liberating soldiers who had already seen significant wartime hardship. The children in the civilian camps, in particular, malnourished, in many cases bearing the marks of tropical diseases, inadequately treated over 3 or 4 years, presented a human accounting of the occupation that photographs of the liberation captured, in terms that no written description fully reproduces. Those photographs are held in the Dutch National Institute for War Documentation in Amsterdam. They are available to researchers. They have not been widely published in the English language historical literature. That gap in the transnational memory of this history is itself a kind of historical fact worth noting. Chapter 8. The Korean Peninsula and the Role of Korean Guards. A history within a history. Among the strangest and most morally complex dimensions of the Pacific War prisoner experience is the story of the Korean Guards, the men who appear in dozens of prisoner testimonies as the enforcers most directly present in the daily lives of Allied POW Jews across the network of camps in Southeast Asia and Japan. Korea had been under Japanese colonial rule since 1910, and by the time of the Pacific War, Korean men were being conscripted or recruited into a range of auxiliary roles in the Japanese military and war economy, including service as guards in prisoner of war camps. Their presence in this story is a thread that historians have traced with increasing care in recent decades because it complicates in important ways the binary narrative, Japanese oppressor, Allied victim, that the broadest popular account of the camps sometimes defaults to. The Korean men who served as PW guards occupied a specific and genuinely difficult structural position. They were themselves subjects of Japanese colonial authority, a system that enforced Japanese cultural and linguistic dominance, suppressed Korean national identity, and operated on a racial hierarchy in which Koreans were definitively subordinate to Japanese. Being assigned as a camp guard was not, for most of these men, a position of chosen power. It was an assignment within a colonial system that had substantial coercive authority over their lives. At the same time, the position gave individual Korean guards authority over Allied prisoners that some of them exercised with particular cruelty. A cruelty that prisoner accounts document with consistency. The post-war war crimes tribunals wrestled with this complexity. Korean guards were prosecuted, some were executed. The question of their culpability, real but mediated by the colonial context in which they operated, has never been fully resolved in the literature and probably cannot be. Prisoner testimony regarding Korean guards carries a specific pattern worth analysing. Many Allied prisoners, particularly Australian survivors, whose accounts have been the most systematically collected, described Korean guards as frequently more willing than Japanese military personnel to administer physical punishment for minor infractions. Historians who have examined this pattern have proposed several explanations that are not mutually exclusive. One is that Korean guards, positioned at the lowest rung of the camp authority structure, may have used their authority over prisoners to compensate for their own subordinate status within the Japanese military hierarchy. Another is that Korean guards, being recent recruits to Japanese military culture, may have internalized and performed the most extreme expressions of that culture's attitudes toward prisoners in ways that the more habituated Japanese personnel no longer felt the need to perform. A third explanation, simpler and probably partially correct, is that the camps drew on a population of guards that in any system would include some individuals inclined toward cruelty, and that the camp environment gave those individuals complete impunity. The broader Korean colonial experience during the Second World War has dimensions that extend far beyond the prisoner camps. Korea was used as a major base of Japanese industrial production, with Korean civilians, men and women both, conscripted for factory and mine labor within Korea, and transported as forced laborers to Japan in numbers that Korean historians estimate in the hundreds of thousands. The comfort women system, through which women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories were coerced into sexual servitude for Japanese military personnel, has been one of the most contentious and politically charged dimensions of Second World War historical memory in East Asia, a subject that Japan and South Korea have engaged in decades of diplomatic and scholarly dispute that has never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of the surviving victims or their advocates. The post-war situation of Korean guards who had served in the Japanese POW camp system was, in terms of raw legal outcome, one of the more troubling aspects of the war crimes trials. Korean guards were tried by Allied military tribunals using the legal framework developed for Japanese military personnel, without significant allowance for the colonial context of their service. 148 Korean guards were tried by Allied war crimes courts. 23 were executed. The Korean colonial government, which might have served as a legal jurisdiction for these cases, did not exist. Korea was divided into American and Soviet occupation zones after the war and the creation of separate Korean states in 1948 further complicated any coherent national legal reckoning. The men tried by Allied courts had no national government to advocate for them, no colonial power that accepted responsibility for the system that had placed them in their wartime roles, and no legal framework that adequately addressed their specific situation. The emergence of this dimension of the camp's story in the scholarly literature has followed the broader development of Korean and East Asian perspectives on the Second World War, a development that was substantially delayed by the Cold War, which gave the United States strategic reasons to downplay Japanese wartime conduct in the interest of building a stable anti-communist ally in the Pacific. The 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, which formally ended the state of war between Japan and the Allied powers, was structured in ways that left significant questions of war responsibility and reparations unresolved, particularly for countries like Korea and China, whose interests were subordinated to Cold War strategic calculations. The long shadow of those unresolved questions still extends into the present, in the form of ongoing diplomatic tensions between Japan and its East Asian neighbors over issues of historical memory, official acknowledgement, and material compensation. For the Allied prisoners who encountered Korean guards in the camps, the national identity of the men guarding them was often secondary to the immediate reality of the power those men held. Survivor accounts that mention Korean guards do so most often in the context of specific interactions: a beating administered, water withheld, or, occasionally, a small act of unauthorized kindness, rather than in the context of broad generalizations about national character. The most careful survivor testimonies consistently acknowledge that individual behavior varied enormously across both Japanese and Korean Guard personnel, and that generalizations about any group's collective conduct in the camps misrepresent the actual diversity of experience. That careful particularity is one of the most striking qualities of the best survivor testimony. The refusal to flatten individual human beings, however great the power they wielded, into simple categories. The Korean Peninsula itself became a theatre of war again in 1950, when the conflict that the world came to know as the Korean War began. Among the American soldiers who fought in Korea were veterans of the Pacific War who had served in the Philippines, in the Pacific Islands, or who had been liberated from Japanese captivity less than 5 years before. They were fighting, again, in East Asia, in a different war over a different set of questions, on terrain that bore no relation to the Pacific War camps. And yet the proximity, both in time and geography, of the two conflicts created an experiential continuity for individual soldiers that the national memory has never quite found a framework to hold. The Korean War's prisoner experience, which generated its own extensive and separately terrible history of captivity, is beyond the scope of this documentary. But the thread between the two histories is real, and it begins in the camps we have been following through these chapters. The story of Korean involvement in the Japanese POW system ultimately resists any single evaluative conclusion. It is a story about colonial power, about what systems do to the people they conscript into service, about the way that historical suffering rarely arranges itself into the clean categories that legal frameworks and popular memory find most comfortable. The men who were beaten by Korean guards were genuinely wronged. The Korean men who administered those beatings were in a structural position shaped by forces larger than their individual choices. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the historical obligation is to hold both truths rather than simplifying toward either one. Chapter 9: Doctors and Diaries. The men who kept the record. In almost every theatre of the Pacific War POW experience, among the most important figures are the ones who appear least frequently in popular histories. The military doctors, the regimental padres, the meticulous amateur record keepers who found in documentation a form of resistance that was available to them when no other form was. The men who kept diaries in the camps, who maintained death registers, who recorded daily ration allocations and medical case histories in whatever materials came to hand: flattened tin cans, cigarette paper, the margins of books, were doing something that carried genuine physical risk. The discovery of a diary by a guard could result in severe punishment. The decision to keep one anyway was, in the specific context of the camps, an act of meaningful courage. The doctors among the Allied prisoner population occupy a particularly extraordinary place in the record. They arrived in captivity, having completed medical training in institutions, equipped with pharmaceutical supplies, surgical instruments, and the basic material preconditions of professional practice, and found themselves responsible for the health of thousands of men in conditions where the most common available medication was willpower, and the primary diagnostic tool was careful observation of symptoms already too advanced for early intervention. The range of conditions they encountered: cholera, dysentery, beriberi, pellagra, tropical ulcers, malaria, scurvy, and the combined physiological effects of sustained malnutrition, was a clinical curriculum that Nova Peacetime Medical School offered, and that produced, among the doctors who survived and returned home, a generation of tropical medicine specialists whose practical knowledge was unmatched anywhere in the world. The name most frequently encountered in the Australian literature about camp medicine is that of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Weary Dunlop, a surgeon who commanded the Australian medical services for a large portion of the Burma-Thailand railway prisoner workforce, and whose diaries, published after the war, became one of the foundational texts of Australian Second World War memory. Dunlop's account is specific in ways that matter. It records not only the medical facts, the surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, the tropical ulcer amputations conducted with tools improvised from camp materials, but the human relationships that developed inside the nightmare of the railway camps, and the specific personality of an institution that was both brutally coercive and, in its human interior, capable of producing extraordinary solidarity. Dunlop became, in the post-war Australian imagination, a figure of near mythological status. A status he would probably have found uncomfortable, given his own detailed record of failure and uncertainty in his diaries. The diaries themselves, as a category of historical document, deserve more attention than they typically receive in surveys of Second World War primary sources. The conditions under which they were kept were often extreme, written in darkness, hidden in food containers, buried in the ground, sewn into clothing. The physical survival of any given diary through the conditions of the camps through searches, through moves between camps, through the chaos of liberation, and through the journey home, represents a chain of individual decisions and fortunate circumstances that could have been broken at any point. The diaries that are now held in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, in the Imperial War Museum in London, in the collection of the National Archives in Washington, and in dozens of university and regimental archives across the Commonwealth, constitute a primary source record of such depth and specificity that historians are still finding new analytical angles in documents that have been known to scholarship for decades. What the diaries record across hundreds of individual voices is not primarily the large events, the surrenders, the marches, the sinkings, but the texture of daily captivity. The precise weight of the rice ration on a given day, the name of the guard who administered or withheld water, the progress of a fellow prisoner's illness, the sound of aircraft that might mean the war was changing, the specific quality of boredom in a prison camp on a day when nothing happened, except hunger. This texture is, in an important sense, the actual history of the camps, more honest than any administrative record, because it is unmediated by institutional purpose and unedited by the awareness of an official audience. These are men writing to themselves, or to an imagined future reader, knowing that the act of writing was both dangerous and necessary. The padres, the military chaplains attached to prisoner populations, kept their own categories of record, which overlap with, but are distinct from the medical documentation. The death registers that padres maintained across dozens of camps are among the most carefully preserved documents in the Pacific War Archive, because they represent the only comprehensive individual record of who died, when, and under what general circumstances. In camps where administrative chaos was the norm, the padre's death register was frequently the only consistent institutional memory. Men who are now named on memorials and in databases compiled by research organizations like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission were often traceable only because a padre, working by candlelight or firelight in a bamboo hut, recorded the date and the name and the unit in a book he kept hidden. The moral weight of that act, accumulated across years and thousands of entries, is considerable. The question of what men thought about during captivity, the psychological interior of the camps, is addressed in the diaries with varying degrees of explicitness. Some diarists wrote about home in rich detail, maintaining a present tense imaginative relationship with places and people that gave the writing a quality of careful preservation, as if putting the memory in words would keep it safe. Others were more guarded, recording facts and events rather than feelings, as if the discipline of observation was itself a psychological anchor. Some diaries contain poetry, some contain sketches, some contain lists of food imagined, of books remembered, of names of people to contact if the writer did not survive. These lists are, in retrospect, among the most quietly affecting documents in the archive. They are the handwriting of men who were making contingency plans for their own death, and doing so in the same careful hand they used to note the daily ration. The historians who have worked most extensively with these documents, Garvin Dawes, E. Bartlett Kerr, Hank Nelson, Joan Beaumont, and a generation of Japanese, Dutch, and Korean scholars working in their own national archives, have consistently noted a quality in the best camp testimony that they describe in various terms as moral precision. The survivors who wrote and spoke most coherently about their experiences were not, by and large, the ones who produced the most emotionally intense accounts. They were the ones who were most careful about the specific distinction between what they had witnessed directly and what they had heard from others, between the conduct of individual guards and the conduct of the system, between hatred of an institution and hatred of a people. That moral precision is in itself a form of resistance. The refusal to process extreme experience into the kind of sweeping judgment that would be understandable, but that would ultimately misrepresent the human complexity of what had actually occurred. The medical knowledge that emerged from the camps was, in the decades after the war, applied across the developing fields of tropical medicine, nutritional medicine, and trauma psychiatry. The doctors who had treated beriberi with improvised thiamine sources, who had managed cholera outbreaks with hand-dug sand filtration systems, who had performed amputations to prevent gangrenous spread from tropical ulcers, using sterilized, improvised instruments. These men returned to civilian medical practice and hospitals with a practical knowledge that had been purchased at enormous human cost, and that the medical establishment of the late 1940s was not always certain how to receive. Several of them wrote clinical papers. Several gave lectures. Some wrote memoirs that were both medical documents and personal reckonings. They form one of the more remarkable cohorts in the history of modern medicine, and the specific knowledge they generated has found its way into medical practice in ways that most contemporary practitioners are unaware of. Chapter 10: The War Inside the Wire. Resistance, Collaboration, and Survival. The narrative of captivity, when it is told primarily from the outside. From the perspective of the historical record, the statistics, the diplomatic and military overview can tend toward a picture of passive suffering, of men acted upon by forces they could not influence. The reality inside the camps was more complicated, more active, and in many cases more morally nuanced than the passive suffering narrative allows. Allied prisoners of war across the Pacific war camp system engaged in a continuous, adaptive, and sometimes extraordinarily creative set of resistance practices that ranged from the small and personal to the organizationally sophisticated. Understanding those practices is not a way of minimizing what the prisoners endured. It is a way of restoring to their experience the human agency that the passive suffering narrative inadvertently removes. The most pervasive form of resistance was sabotage, the slow, careful, individually deniable degradation of the war production that prisoner labor was supposed to support. Men building ships in Japanese dockyards quietly reversed bolts. Men working in factories misaligned tolerances within the margins of their own plausible incompetence. Men on the Burma-Thailand Railway packed earthworks loosely where they could, placed ballast incorrectly, and in at least some documented cases worked deliberate weaknesses into bridges that collapsed within months of construction. The Library of Congress materials on this subject contain specific accounts from American prisoners who describe the psychology of sabotage in precise terms, the calculation of what you could get away with given the guards watching you, the satisfaction of the small invisible act of defiance in a situation where direct defiance was suicidal. This was resistance as craft, requiring patience, situational intelligence, and the ability to appear diligent while being systematically unreliable. Radio sets represent the most technically demanding and organizationally complex form of camp resistance, and the stories of their construction and operation are among the most remarkable in the entire captivity literature. In camp after camp, at Changi, at Cabanatuan in the Philippines, at camps in Java, at facilities in Japan, small groups of prisoners with electrical and engineering backgrounds, clandestinely built radio receivers from components accumulated over months, using salvaged parts from camp equipment, purchased or stolen components, and in some cases, items smuggled in through networks involving sympathetic civilians or guards willing to accept payment in the form of food, valuables taken into captivity, or promises of post-war gratitude. The sets they built allowed prisoners to receive news broadcasts, primarily the BBC World Service and later American military broadcasts, giving them access to accurate information about the course of the war in a context where the Japanese camp administration provided only the information it calculated to be demoralizing. The news these radio sets delivered was, in many cases, genuinely sustaining. Men who knew, from a clandestine radio intercept in the spring of 1943, that Allied forces were advancing in North Africa, that the tide at Stalingrad had turned, that the Americans were fighting back in the Solomon Islands, were in a different psychological position than men who knew nothing beyond the walls of their camp. The information circulated through camps in whispered networks, passed person to person, through established chains of trust, the source of the information always carefully concealed to protect the set and its operators. The penalty for radio possession, if discovered, was death, a fact that makes the men who built and operated these sets among the more remarkable figures in the entire history of the camps, operating with the knowledge that a single informer or a single careless moment could end everything. The command structure that Allied officers maintained within the camps was itself a form of resistance, though one that operated through accommodation as much as defiance. Senior Allied officers, British, Australian, Dutch, and American, negotiated constantly with Japanese camp commandants over work assignments, ration allocations, medical supplies, and the treatment of prisoners by guards. The records of these negotiations, preserved in post-war testimony, and in the reports that officers wrote upon liberation, reveal a continuous process of strategic engagement with the camp authority, accepting the reality of their powerlessness in structural terms, while finding in the details of daily administration the spaces where small improvements could be wrested from a system fundamentally indifferent to their welfare. These officers walked a line that occasionally brought them into conflict with fellow prisoners who felt they were too accommodating to their captors, and that occasionally brought them into confrontation with Japanese commandants who felt they were insufficiently compliant. The question of collaboration, of prisoners who cooperated with Japanese authorities in ways that went beyond what captivity required, appears in the historical record in a range of forms that resist simple categorization. Some prisoners acted as informers for material benefit. Some provided Japanese interrogators with information beyond what the Geneva Convention's name, rank, and service number standard permitted. Some civilians in the internment camps facilitated Japanese administrative control in ways that made their own conditions somewhat more tolerable. Post-war communities were in some cases unforgiving of these individuals. The camp courts that operated informally in some facilities, judging alleged collaborators and informers against the prisoner's own community standards, issued punishments that ranged from social ostracism to physical violence. The post-war military justice process dealt with a small number of such cases formally. The majority of collaboration questions were settled or left unsettled within communities of survivors who had their own unmediated knowledge of what had happened and who had to decide, together, what it meant. The experiences of prisoners who escaped or attempted to escape, from Pacific War camps form a chapter within a chapter that the popular imagination, shaped largely by European war escape narratives, tends to project onto the Pacific context in ways that don't entirely fit. The geography of the Pacific war camp system made successful escape profoundly difficult in ways that European camps did not typically present. A man who escaped from a camp in Thailand or Malaya or Java was in dense jungle, surrounded by local populations who might or might not offer shelter thousands of kilometers from any Allied territory, unable to speak local languages, and physically distinctive in a way that made sustained concealment almost impossible. The calculus was different from escaping in occupied France and walking to neutral Switzerland. As a result, escape attempts were fewer, success rates were lower, and the penalties imposed on men who were recaptured and on their fellow prisoners, who were sometimes collectively punished, were severe. This is not a reflection of lesser courage, but of a different set of physical realities. The psychological methods that prisoners developed to maintain mental health under conditions of profound deprivation and uncertainty have attracted increasing scholarly attention in the decades since the war, as the study of resilience, trauma, and post-traumatic experience has developed as a serious research field. The strategies that appear most consistently across survivor accounts: the maintenance of routine, the cultivation of humor, the preservation of small rituals of self-care, the deliberate creation of projects requiring sustained mental engagement, anticipate with striking precision many of the interventions that modern psychological practice has developed for treating people in extreme circumstances. The men who designed these strategies were not working from any psychological theory. They were working from common sense, from the observation of what worked and what didn't in the specific conditions of their captivity. The correspondence between their adaptive strategies and modern, evidence-based practice is, to anyone who works in both fields, one of the more quietly remarkable convergences in the entire history of this subject. Chapter 11. The End of the War. Liberation, Abandonment, and the Impossible Return. In the summer of 1945, as the military situation of Imperial Japan moved from critical to terminal, the men inside the Pacific War's prisoner camps existed in a condition of peculiar suspended uncertainty. They knew from clandestine radio sets, from the behavior of guards whose fear was becoming unmistakable, from the Allied aircraft that now passed overhead with near impunity, that the war was approaching its end. They did not know when. They did not know in what form liberation would come, and many of them had reason to fear that the end of the war would not automatically mean their survival. Documentation recovered after the war, orders issued by Japanese military authorities to camp commandants in the event of an Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, indicated that in that scenario, prisoners were not to be permitted to fall back into Allied hands. The Tokyo Tribunal entered these orders into evidence. They are a matter of historical record, and they mean exactly what they appear to mean. The first atomic device used in warfare was dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945. The second was dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria on the 8th of August. Japan's Emperor Hirohito recorded his surrender broadcast on the 14th of August, and it was transmitted on the 15th. For the prisoners in the camps, the sequence of events between the atomic detonations and the formal surrender announcement was a period of extraordinary tension. They knew something decisive had happened. They did not yet know what, and the guards around them were operating in a state of institutional shock that made their behavior unpredictable in new and frightening ways. Liberation, when it came, was not a single event. It was a process that played out across weeks, across thousands of kilometers, in conditions of enormous logistical complexity. The United States military had prepared for Operation Blacklist, the occupation of Japan following its surrender, with detailed planning that included the identification and liberation of prisoner of war camps. Teams of Allied officers, some of them specifically trained for this mission, parachuted into identified camp locations beginning in late August of 1945. They arrived in facilities where the Japanese guards had in some cases already left, where prisoners had in some cases already taken down the wire, and where the human condition they found was, in almost every instance, worse than their preliminary intelligence had suggested. The men they were liberating were not the men who had entered captivity. They were thinner, older, marked in ways that clothing could cover, but physical examinations could not. The full extent of what had happened to them would take weeks, and in many cases years, to fully document. The liberation of camps in remote locations, in the outer islands of Japan, in northern Borneo, in the scattered islands of the Pacific, followed different timelines. Japanese forces in some areas were slow to receive or act on the surrender announcement. In a number of cases, small groups of prisoners were held for weeks after the formal surrender, before Allied forces were able to reach them. In Borneo, where the Australian 9th Division was the primary Allied force operating, the liberation of camps at Sandakan and Ranau revealed a situation of almost complete catastrophe. The Sandakan prisoner population, primarily Australian and British soldiers, had been subjected, in the final year of the war, to a series of forced marches through jungle terrain that bear a structural resemblance to the Bataan Death March, and that produced comparable mortality. Of approximately 2,400 Allied prisoners originally held at Sandakan, 6 survived. The others had died of the marches, of starvation, of illness, or had been executed. The 6 survivors had escaped into the jungle and been sheltered by local people. Sandakan is the single deadliest prisoner of war atrocity suffered by Australian forces in any conflict, and it remains less known than it should be. Outside of Australia, even within communities with a serious interest in Pacific War history, the physical process of repatriation, of moving liberated prisoners from camps across the Pacific to the ships and aircraft that would eventually return them to their home countries, was a logistical undertaking of enormous scale managed under conditions of significant organizational chaos. Men whose medical conditions required immediate hospitalization were, in some cases, processed through systems that were not prepared to receive them. Men who were ambulatory but severely malnourished needed nutritional management that not all repatriation centers immediately provided. The medical records of liberated prisoners in the weeks following the war contain multiple cases of men who became seriously ill during repatriation from the effects of being fed too much, too quickly, after years of starvation. The human body's response to sudden caloric abundance after prolonged deprivation is itself a medical emergency. The doctors who had managed their patients through years of starvation were now managing them through liberation, and the problems were different, but still required specialist knowledge. The return home carried its own set of impossible negotiations. Men who had been held for 3.5 years came back to families who had aged, to children who did not recognize them, to countries that had changed, communities that wanted to celebrate their survival without necessarily wanting to hear what had produced it. The culture of the mid-1940s in Britain, in Australia, in the United States, in the Netherlands, was not equipped to receive the specific testimony of men returning from Pacific War captivity in a way that would have been clinically appropriate. The language of trauma, the cultural permission to name what had happened in its full specificity, the professional infrastructure of post-traumatic support, none of these things existed in the forms they would later develop. The men who came home largely did not speak about what they had experienced, or spoke about it in carefully edited forms, or spoke about it only to each other. In the communities of survivors that became one of the primary social structures of the post-war decades, the marriages and family lives of returned prisoners carry a dimension of this history that has been documented most sensitively by the historians and psychologists who worked with survivor communities in the 1980s and 90s, when the men were elderly and the women who had waited for them, or the women they had married after returning, were sometimes willing to speak. The accounts from partners of returned prisoners describe with considerable consistency men who had become careful and quiet in ways that were difficult to interpret, who had episodes of distress triggered by specific sensory inputs. The smell of rice cooking, the sound of a particular kind of machinery, who struggled in specific social situations while appearing entirely functional in others. This was post-traumatic stress disorder without that name, managed through stoicism and silence, and the particular mid-century masculine culture that framed the refusal to discuss suffering as a form of strength. It was also, in the decades before adequate therapeutic infrastructure existed, arguably the only available strategy for men who needed to rebuild lives in a world that wanted them to be simply grateful to be alive. The gratitude was real. The damage was also real. Both things existed simultaneously in the same bodies and the same lives. The men who had survived the camps had done something that no amount of historical documentation can fully convey. They had maintained, over years of conditions designed to destroy both physical and psychological integrity, a degree of human coherence that their liberation medics, their liberating soldiers, and their families consistently described as extraordinary. That coherence was not achieved through the absence of suffering, but through its endurance and the specific adaptive strategies, individual and collective, that the preceding chapters have tried to document. The homecoming was not an ending. It was a different kind of beginning, carrying everything that had come before it. Chapter 12, the Tokyo Trials and the Question of Accountability. Justice attempted, justice incomplete. On the 3rd of May, 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which history has largely come to call the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal or the Tokyo Trials, convened in the former Japanese War Ministry building in Tokyo and began a process of legal reckoning with the conduct of Imperial Japan that would run for more than 2 years, produce an 11-volume judgment, and generate historiographical controversy that has not been resolved in the 80 years since. The tribunal was modelled on the Nuremberg Tribunal that had recently concluded in Europe and shared with it the fundamental legal challenge of constructing criminal accountability for acts that had been committed under the authority of a state by individuals who had operated within that state's chain of command in a legal framework that had not, at the time of the acts, been precisely codified in the form now being applied. The phrase that legal philosophers use for this challenge, the question of ex post facto law, was raised at Nuremberg. It was raised again at Tokyo. The tribunals proceeded anyway, on the reasonable ground that the absence of existing law did not make the documented conduct any less criminal. The tribunal was composed of 11 judges, one from each of the Allied powers that had been at war with Japan: the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand, the Philippines, the Soviet Union, China, and India. The Indian judge, Radhabinod Pal, delivered the most extensive and consequential dissent in the tribunal's history. A judgment of more than 1,000 pages arguing that the defendants had not been proven guilty according to the standards of international law as it existed at the time of their acts, and that the entire proceeding was itself a form of victor's justice that could not be considered impartial. Pal's dissent is, in the historiography, one of the more cited documents in the entire body of work on Pacific War legal accountability. Cited by those who share his conclusions, cited by those who disagree with him, but respect the rigor of his argument, and cited by Japanese nationalists, who have sometimes used his conclusions in ways that go considerably beyond what his own careful legal reasoning supports. 28 men were indicted as Class A war criminals, accused of crimes against peace, meaning the planning and waging of aggressive war. Before the Tokyo Tribunal, 7 were sentenced to death and hanged on the 23rd of December 1948 at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. Among them was General Hideki Tojo, who had served as Prime Minister of Japan during the majority of the Pacific War. 16 defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment. Several others received shorter sentences. The legal proceedings were conducted in both English and Japanese, with simultaneous interpretation across more than 800 days of hearings, a logistical undertaking that itself represented a significant institutional achievement, quite apart from the substantive legal outcomes. The treatment of Allied prisoners of war was a significant element of the evidentiary record at the Tokyo Tribunal, but it was addressed primarily through the broader framework of war crimes and crimes against humanity, rather than as the tribunal's central focus. More targeted accountability for specific prisoner-related atrocities was addressed through a parallel system of Class B and Class C war crimes trials conducted by individual Allied nations at sites across the Pacific. These included trials in Singapore, in Manila, in Rabaul, in Hong Kong, and in Japan itself. Approximately 5,600 individuals were tried in these proceedings, spanning multiple national jurisdictions with different procedural standards. Approximately 920 were executed. The variation in procedural standards across the different national proceedings has been a consistent source of criticisms in the legal literature, with scholars noting that the quality of defense available to defendants varied enormously depending on which Allied power was conducting the trial. Emperor Hirohito's exemption from prosecution is the decision that has generated more sustained controversy in the Tokyo trial's historiography than any other single aspect of the proceedings. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the Allied occupation of Japan, made the determination, supported by the United States government, that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize the occupation by removing the one institutional figure who had been able to command the compliance of Japanese military units across Asia with his surrender broadcast. The pragmatic argument for this decision is not without force. The countervailing argument that accountability for a system of warfare in which the emperor was constitutionally sovereign was fundamentally incomplete without addressing his role is also not without force. The historian Herbert Bix, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Hirohito, published in 2000, argued on the basis of Japanese primary sources that Hirohito's active involvement in wartime decision-making was substantially greater than the tribunal's framing as a constitutional monarch acting on the advice of his ministers acknowledged. The debate remains live in the scholarship. The issue of corporate accountability for the use of prisoner labor was, in the legal framework of the Tokyo trials and the parallel proceedings, almost entirely unaddressed. The Zaibatsu companies, the great industrial conglomerates that had contracted for and benefited from prisoner and conscript labor, were the subject of economic deconcentration orders issued by the occupation authorities. But this was an economic restructuring measure rather than a war crimes prosecution. No Japanese corporation was tried for the conditions under which prisoners worked in its facilities. No corporate officer was prosecuted for the maintenance of prisoner labor under conditions that resulted in mass death. The legal framework of 1946 simply did not extend to corporate criminal liability in the way that later international law would develop. The prisoners who had worked in those facilities and who were alive to observe the trials were largely aware of this gap. Their accounts of the trials reflect a complicated mixture of satisfaction at the formal accountability they observed and frustration at the gaps that formal accountability left visible. The trials produced, as a secondary effect, an enormous evidentiary archive. The testimony and documentation entered into the tribunal record that subsequently became available to historians, and that has been a significant resource for the scholarship developed in the decades since. The depositions of former camp commandants, the operational orders that were entered into evidence, the statistical documentation of prisoner deaths compiled by Allied prosecutors. All of this material sits in archives in Tokyo, in Washington, in Canberra, and in London, and has been systematically analysed by researchers who have found in it both confirmation of the broad outlines of the historical record and specific details that the popular account has never fully incorporated. The archive of the Tokyo trials is, in this sense, an ongoing historical resource rather than a closed record. It continues to yield new findings to researchers willing to engage with it at sufficient depth. For the survivors of the camps, the trials represented a form of public acknowledgement that was meaningful but imperfect. The proceedings gave the documented record an institutional authority. These things were established in a court of law by a tribunal of international composition on the basis of evidence tested through adversarial examination. That private memoir and survivor testimony, however accurate and however compelling, could not provide in the same way. But the imperfections of the proceedings, the exemptions, the corporate immunity, the variation in procedural quality, the political calculations embedded in several of the major decisions, meant that the justice the trials delivered was partial in ways that the survivors recognized with clarity. They had spent years inside a system that operated in the conviction that they did not matter. The trials said, in measured legal language, that they had mattered. That the legal statement was incomplete did not make it worthless. It made it insufficient, which is a different thing. The broader question of Japanese national reckoning with the Pacific War, the development over the decades from 1945 to the present of a domestic Japanese account of what the imperial military did in Asia and in the camps, is a subject too large and too contested to be adequately addressed in a single chapter. What can be said with accuracy is that the Japanese reckoning has been real, partial, politically turbulent, and ongoing. Japanese historians, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and educators have produced serious work engaging with the specific history of the POW camps, the Burma Railway, the Hell Ships, and the forced labor system. The Yushukan Museum at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, which presents a nationalist interpretation of the Pacific War that many historians consider incompatible with the documented record, stands as evidence of the political contestation that this history continues to generate within Japan. It stands alongside a substantial body of Japanese scholarship that takes a directly contrary view. Evidence that the debate within Japan is genuine rather than monolithic. The Tokyo trials ended. The sentences were served or carried out. The legal record was filed. The survivors went home. The camps fell into jungle or were built over, or, in a few cases, preserved as memorial sites. The physical evidence of what had happened in them, the fence posts, the hut foundations, the latrine trenches, the burial sites, was absorbed back into the landscape of countries that had their own histories, their own presence, their own futures to tend to. The human evidence, the men and women who had been inside those fences, remained. They aged. Many of them kept their silence for decades. Some eventually spoke. Their children and grandchildren, in the early decades of the 21st century, have in some cases taken on the work of preserving and transmitting what was given to them. That transmission, imperfect, incomplete, shaped by the particular filters of family memory and individual temperament, is itself a form of accountability that no tribunal can fully replace, and that no documentary, however long or carefully researched, can fully substitute for. What it can do is point toward the archive, toward the testimony, toward the specific names and dates and places where this history lives in its most detailed and irreducible form. The pointing matters. The rest is your work if you choose to do it. Chapter 13. Women and Children Behind Wire. The Civilian Internment Camps. When most people picture a prisoner of the Pacific War, they picture a soldier, a man in uniform, captured after battle, placed behind wire by a military authority that at least nominally recognized him as a combatant. That picture, accurate as far as it goes, leaves out a population that numbered in the tens of thousands, that suffered across more than 350 camps, spread from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies to Hong Kong, and that has received only a fraction of the historical attention directed at its military counterpart. More than 130,000 Allied civilians were interned by Japan during the Pacific War. 50,000 men, 42,000 women, and 40,000 children, and more than 14,000 of them did not survive their imprisonment. These were not soldiers. They were teachers, missionaries, nurses, plantation managers, colonial administrators, business people, and their families. They were there because the Japanese Empire had swept across a geography in which they had been living their ordinary lives, and the new authorities had decided they needed to be removed from that geography and placed somewhere controllable. The legal framework governing civilian internees was separate from, and in practice even weaker than, the framework governing military prisoners of war. Civilian internees were held under the authority of the Hague Regulations of 1907 rather than the 1929 Geneva Convention. But Japan's adherence to either set of principles was, as the military prisoner experience had already demonstrated, inconsistent at best and absent at worst. The practical effect was that civilian internees existed in a legal condition of significant ambiguity. They were not combatants entitled to the minimum provisions of POW status, but they were also not, in formal terms, criminals deserving punishment. They occupied a category that the Japanese administrative system handled with enormous variation. Some civilian internment camps were relatively ordered and survivable. Others were places of progressive deterioration that killed their inhabitants through systematic deprivation as surely as any overtly violent act. The Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila represents one of the most extensively documented civilian internment experiences in the Pacific War. Established on the grounds of the University of Santo Tomas in January of 1942, the camp initially held more than 3,000 Allied civilians, primarily American, with a substantial population of British, Dutch, and other Allied nationals. In its early months, it operated with a degree of internal autonomy that was unusual in the broader camp system. The internees were permitted to organize their own internal administration, to run schools for the children, to maintain a small commercial economy within the camp, where those with resources could supplement the inadequate Japanese-provided rations, and even to publish an internal newspaper, a publication called Internews, whose first issue appeared on the 24th of January, 1942, less than 3 weeks after the camp opened. The existence of that newspaper is one of the more extraordinary facts in the entire civilian internment history. A community under captivity producing organized, printed journalism from its first month because the journalists were among the first civilians interned. And they did what journalists do. The conditions at Santo Tomas deteriorated substantially as the war progressed and as Japanese supply allocations were reduced to match the declining fortunes of the empire. By late 1944, internees were receiving rations so inadequate that the medical records compiled by the camp's doctors described a population in active starvation. When American forces of the 1st Cavalry Division liberated Santo Tomas on the 3rd of February 1945 as part of the broader Battle of Manila, they found more than 4,000 civilians in a state of severe malnutrition. The liberation did not immediately resolve the physical condition of the internees. The sudden reintroduction of adequate calories to bodies that had been starved for 3 years required careful medical management, and the accounts of liberation medical personnel described children who had spent their formative years in the camp and whose physical development had been measurably affected by years of nutritional inadequacy. More than 16% of the civilian population held in Philippine camps throughout the war were children and teenagers. Those children came home carrying a captivity in their bodies as well as their memories. The women who led the civilian internment camps, because it was predominantly women who organized the internal life of the women's and family camps, represent one of the more remarkable leadership cohorts produced by the Second World War, and one that has received dramatically less recognition than comparable male figures. In the women's camps of the Dutch East Indies, across the camps of Malaya and Singapore, in the civilian sections of Hong Kong internment facilities, the women who had professional backgrounds before the war, nurses, teachers, doctors, missionaries, stepped into leadership roles that the camp's internal structure made available to them. The literature that emerged from these women, memoirs, diaries, oral histories recorded in the post-war decades, describes a collective experience of institutional construction, the deliberate building of schools, the organization of medical care with almost no supplies, the maintenance of routines and rituals for children that were intended to provide the psychological scaffolding of normalcy in circumstances that were nothing of the kind. The single women who had been nuns, missionaries, and nurses before internment frequently emerged as some of the most resilient leaders in the camps. in part because the collective structures of their pre-war professional lives had already equipped them for communal existence under difficult conditions. The children who passed through civilian internment camps are perhaps the most difficult subject in the entire literature of Pacific War. Captivity, not because their experiences are poorly documented, but because the documentation that exists requires a particular kind of careful engagement. Children who were 2 or 3 years old when the camps were established, and 6 or 7 when they were liberated, have, in interviews conducted in the post-war decades, described captivity not as an interruption of normal life, but as the context in which their understanding of the world was formed. Their categories of normal included barbed wire, inadequate food, roll calls, and the continuous presence of armed authority. The reintegration of these children into post-war societies, which expected them to seamlessly adopt the categories of a normal world they had never actually known, was, in many cases, a process of prolonged and inadequately supported difficulty. Several of the most thoughtful memoirs to emerge from the civilian internment experience were written by people who were children in the camps, and they share a quality of attempting to translate a fundamentally alien childhood into terms that readers who grew up outside wire could recognize. The civilian internment experience in Hong Kong carries specific features that distinguish it from the Philippines and East Indies chapters. When Hong Kong fell to Japanese forces on Christmas Day of 1941, the civilian European and American population became internees of the Sham Shui Po camp, and, for women and children, of the Stanley internment camp on the southern coast of Hong Kong Island. Stanley held a remarkable cross-section of Hong Kong's pre-war colonial community. British civil servants, business people, and their families, alongside American civilians and a smaller number of other Allied nationals. The camp diary and memoir literature from Stanley is extensive, and it includes accounts of a community that was simultaneously highly educated and resourceful enough to maintain organized intellectual and cultural life within the camp, and progressively starving as rations declined through 1944. The tension between the cultural vitality that some accounts of Stanley describe and the physical deterioration that the medical records simultaneously document is one of the more striking paradoxes in the civilian internment literature. Evidence that human beings are capable of extraordinary cultural activity in conditions that are simultaneously destroying their physical health. The post-war account of civilian internees was shaped, in most countries, by a tendency to subsume their experiences within the broader category of military prisoner experience, with the civilian dimension treated as a footnote to the military narrative. This is a reflection of the cultures that wrote those accounts. Cultures organized around the primacy of military service and sacrifice, in which the suffering of civilians, particularly women and children, was acknowledged but not elevated to the same commemorative status as combat or military captivity. The 42,000 women and 40,000 children who passed through civilian internment camps did not receive, in most countries, the veterans organizations, the pension provisions, the formal commemorative infrastructure, or the sustained official attention that military prisoners received. In Australia, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, civilian former internees organized their own advocacy groups and eventually achieved some formal recognition. But the process was long, contentious, and in every country arrived decades after the parallel military recognition was established. The gap is itself a form of historical evidence about which forms of suffering a society finds easiest to acknowledge and which it finds most convenient to set aside. The 14,000 civilian internees who died in captivity are commemorated in a variety of ways across the memorial landscape of the former Pacific War theatre, but the commemoration is less systematic and less well-resourced than the military equivalent. Commonwealth War Graves Commission records include some civilian deaths, but the Commission's primary mandate covers military personnel, and the civilian dimension of its Pacific War work has been a subject of ongoing discussion about the adequacy of the current framework. Many civilian internees who died in the camps were buried in locations that subsequent development has built over, commemorated in records that are scattered across multiple national archives, or represented on family-level memorials rather than official national ones. The process of compiling a comprehensive accounting of civilian internment deaths, work that researchers at institutions, including the Imperial War Museum in London and the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation in Amsterdam, have been engaged with for decades, is not complete, and there is no reasonable expectation that it will be complete in any final sense. Some names will not be recovered. Some stories will not be told. This is one of the more quiet and enduring forms of loss that the camps produced, and it continues into the present. Chapter 14, Sandakan, the atrocity that Australia has never fully processed. There is a place in the historical record of the Pacific War that sits in a category of its own, not because its moral dimensions are more severe than other atrocities in this history, but because the totality of destruction at a single site was so complete that the word survivor applied only to 6 individuals out of a population that had once numbered in the thousands. Sandakan, in the northeastern corner of British North Borneo, now the Malaysian state of Sabah, was home to the largest concentration of Australian prisoners of war outside Australia's own territory. Of the approximately 2,500 Australian and British soldiers imprisoned at Sandakan between 1942 and 1940, 6 men came home. All 6 were Australian. All 6 survived not because the camp released them, but because they escaped into jungle and were sheltered by local people who risked their own lives to keep them alive. The remainder, the other 2,494, died of illness, starvation, execution, or the specific intersection of all 3 that defined the Sandakan death marches. The story of Sandakan begins, as several of the worst Pacific War POW stories begin, with what appears, in the early months, to be a manageable situation. When Australian prisoners began arriving at Sandakan in mid-1942, assigned to build an airstrip for the Japanese military, the conditions at the camp were severe, but not yet catastrophically so. The men were underfed, the work was hard, the guards were often brutal, but the population remained functionally alive. An underground resistance network, organized among the prisoners with the support of some local civilians, and operating with considerable sophistication, given the risks involved, managed to smuggle medicines and additional food into the camp for a period of roughly 2 years. When this network was discovered by the Japanese authorities in 1943, the response was savage. The civilians involved were executed, and the camp conditions tightened in ways that destroyed the buffer the network had been providing. By the middle of 1944, the men at Sandakan were dying at a rate that reflected the intersection of malnutrition, tropical disease, and the complete withdrawal of any meaningful medical supply. Rations had been reduced to a level that was not physiologically compatible with the labour demands being imposed. By September of 1944, 120 Australians and 90 British prisoners had already died, even before the worst was to come. Allied bombing raids on Borneo in September of 1944 and April of 1945 killed an additional 33 prisoners, men killed by the forces that were simultaneously the only realistic hope of their liberation. This is a particular feature of the Sandakan story that the post-war accounting has found difficult to hold alongside the liberation narrative. The specific deaths of prisoners caused by Allied air attacks on Japanese military infrastructure in a camp whose location the attacking aircraft had no way of knowing. The decision to march the surviving prisoners from Sandakan westward to Ranau, a journey of approximately 260 kilometers through Borneo's rugged interior, was made by the Japanese camp authorities in late 1944 as Allied forces advanced toward Borneo and the security of the coastal camp became uncertain. There were 3 separate marches spread across the final months of the war. The men who were sent on these marches were already profoundly weakened. They were given inadequate food for a journey that would test healthy, well-provisioned soldiers. They were marching through jungle terrain on tracks that were, at points, barely passable. Men who fell behind the column were killed by the guards escorting the march. Men who were too ill to march at all were left at Sandakan, where all of them subsequently died or were executed. The march was not a transfer of prisoners. It was, in effect, a sequential process of elimination conducted through the instrumentality of impossible physical demands. Of the approximately 500 prisoners who reached Ranau in the first 2 groups of marches, not one survived. The conditions at Ranau, which had no adequate accommodation, no medical supplies, and a rice allocation that was measured in the smallest possible units, killed the men who arrived there within weeks of arrival. Those who could not work were shot when the camp authorities ran out of other ways to dispose of them. The final group of prisoners who reached Ranau, 142 Australians and 61 British soldiers who survived the last march, were dead by early August of 1945, some killed by Japanese guards in what appears, from the available documentation, to have been a deliberate decision to eliminate the remaining witness population as it became clear that Allied forces were approaching. The formal surrender of Japan was announced on the 15th of August. The last killings at Ranau appear to have taken place on approximately the 1st of August. The men died days before the war ended, without knowing that it was about to. The 6 survivors, all Australians who escaped at different points during the marches, and were sheltered by local Suluk and other indigenous people in the Borneo jungle, provided the primary witness accounts on which the post-war documentation of Sandakan is based. Their testimony, taken by Australian war crimes investigators in the weeks following liberation, is held in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra and forms the evidentiary foundation of the proceedings that subsequently tried Japanese officers responsible for the camp's administration and the marches. The investigations and trials produced convictions, including death sentences for officers directly responsible for the marches and for the execution orders at Ranau. But the investigations were constrained by the fundamental problem that confronted all Pacific war crimes prosecutions. The survivors who could corroborate each other's testimony numbered only 6, and the documentary record that might otherwise have been available had been partially destroyed in the final weeks of Japanese occupation. The evidentiary picture was assembled from fragment and inference, as much as from direct testimony. The post-war commemoration of Sandakan in Australia has been shaped by a combination of intense local community grief, particularly in the state of Queensland from which a significant proportion of the Australian prisoners at Sandakan had been drawn, and a national commemorative landscape that, for many decades, did not give Sandakan the same prominence as Tobruk, Gallipoli, or even the Burma Railway. The reasons for this relative absence from the national memory Najma are complex and not reducible to indifference. The fact that there were only 6 survivors meant there was no large survivor community to advocate for recognition. The remote location meant few Australians had a personal or geographic connection to the site. And the totality of the loss at Sandakan made it, paradoxically, harder to narrate than atrocities that had larger survivor populations. It is easier to tell a story when you have many voices to tell it with. The Sandakan story had 6, and the weight of what those 6 voices had to carry was almost impossibly heavy. The Sandakan Death March is described by the Australian War Memorial as the greatest single atrocity committed against Australians in war. A statement that encompasses every conflict Australia has been involved in, from the Boer War to the present. It remains less known outside Australia than this characterization might suggest. The international community's awareness of Sandakan is substantially lower than its awareness of the Bataan Death March or the Burma Railway, both of which had survivor populations large enough to generate extensive memoir literature, formal commemoration infrastructure, and the kind of sustained public advocacy that keeps a historical event in active circulation. Sandkanan does not have equivalent infrastructure because it does not have equivalent survivor numbers. The memorial that stands today at the Sandakan site, in a location that the post-war development of the city has surrounded with the ordinary landscape of contemporary urban Malaysia, commemorates, in the only form that physical memorials can, a population whose near-complete destruction left almost no one to speak directly for it. The local people of Sandakan and the surrounding region of North Borneo, who sheltered the 6 survivors who were executed for their involvement in the prisoner resistance network, who lived under Japanese occupation for the duration of the war, appear in the historical record primarily as supporting figures in a story centered on the Australian and British prisoners. This framing is understandable given the documentary record available, but it is worth pausing on the degree to which local civilian suffering in the occupied territories of Southeast Asia has consistently been subordinated to the Allied prisoner narrative in the popular historical account. The civilians of Borneo, who were executed for helping prisoners, who were conscripted as labourers, who endured the violence and extraction of 3 years of Japanese occupation, had their own experience of the war that deserves more than a supporting role in a narrative organised around the experiences of captured outsiders. The gradual development of Malaysian and Indonesian national histories of the Japanese occupation. Histories written from the perspective of the occupied populations rather than the occupying power or its captured enemies is one of the more important ongoing developments in the broader historiography of the Pacific War. Chapter 15, The Long Silence. What survivors carried home and could not say. The psychological literature on Pacific War POW survivors is one of the more densely documented bodies of research on the long-term effects of extreme captivity in the entire field of trauma studies, and its findings carry an uncomfortable weight that the popular narrative of the greatest generation, the post-war cultural framework that celebrated veterans' stoicism and forward orientation, has never fully absorbed. A study published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, drawing on 40 years of follow-up data from Pacific Theatre prisoners, found that 34% of Pacific War POW survivors met the current diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of assessment, 3 times the rate found in European theatre POW survivors, and roughly double the rate found in combat veterans who had not been imprisoned. These figures were measured in men who were, at the time of assessment, in their 70s and 80s. The trauma was not receding with age. In many cases, it was intensifying. Men who had managed their symptoms through the structured demands of working life found, after retirement removed that structure, that the memories returned with a force they had not encountered for decades. The post-war silence that the Pacific War survivors maintained about their captivity was not, in most cases, a choice in the full sense of that word. It was a response to the social environment they returned to, a mid-century culture that did not have the language, the professional infrastructure, or the cultural permission to receive what these men had to say. The men who came home from the camps of Burma, Japan, and the Philippines returned to societies organized around the imperative of forward movement, rebuild, recover, make families, make lives, be grateful, be strong, be quiet about the things that silence is less painful than speech. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist in clinical literature until 1980, when it was formally codified in the American Psychiatric Association's Third Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Before that codification, the constellation of symptoms that these men were experiencing, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the specific sensory triggers, the intrusive memories, the difficulty with intimate relationships, was either unnamed or given labels that did not carry the same diagnostic weight. Shell shock was a First World War term. Battle fatigue was a Second World War military euphemism. Neither captured what happened to a man who spent 3.5 years in a camp where he was systematically starved, used for forced labor, and held in continuous uncertainty about whether he would survive. The sleep disturbance that Pacific War POW survivors reported across multiple decades of study is one of the most consistently documented findings in the entire post-war literature on captivity trauma. The nightmares that survivors described were not vague or impressionistic. They were specific. They replicated, with high fidelity, the sensory details of the camps. The smell of the food that was not there, the sound of a specific guard's approach, the particular quality of light in a bamboo hut at a specific time of day. Men in their 70s were waking in the night to sounds and images that their nervous systems had encoded 40 years earlier, and that no subsequent experience had been sufficient to overwrite. The persistence of these specific sensory memories, as opposed to the fading and abstraction that characterizes the normal arc of older memories over time, is consistent with what trauma neuroscience has subsequently established about the way extreme threat experiences are encoded differently from ordinary autobiographical memory, in ways that make them more vivid, more intrusive, and more resistant to the natural processes of memory decay. The families of returned Pacific War prisoners have, in the post-war literature, described the domestic consequences of the camps in terms that are consistent across nationalities, generations, and cultural contexts. The Australian wives and partners of returned prisoners, interviewed by oral historians in the 1980s and 90s, described men who were physically present and functionally competent, who worked, who provided, who maintained the social surface of normal family life, but who were emotionally absent in specific ways. Men who could not sit with their backs to a room. Men who ate with a speed and defensiveness that had no relationship to the food in front of them. Men who were triggered to states of profound distress by specific sounds. The clattering of metal implements, the smell of rice cooking, the sound of raised voices in a language they did not speak, and who responded to these triggers with responses that the people around them found alarming and inexplicable. The families who absorbed these responses without adequate explanation or support were themselves carrying a secondary burden that the post-war welfare system was not equipped to identify, let alone address. The children of Pacific War POW survivors, the second generation, have, in the scholarship that developed from the 1990s onward, been identified as a population experiencing what the clinical literature terms secondary or intergenerational trauma, the mechanisms through which extreme trauma can affect the children of those who experienced it are both psychological and, emerging research suggests, potentially epigenetic. Changes in gene expression produced by extreme stress that can be transmitted across generations in ways that current science is only beginning to map. The second generation accounts that appear in the oral history literature. Adult children of returned prisoners describing their own anxiety patterns, their own specific fears, their own sense of carrying something they did not fully understand, provide a human account of intergenerational transmission that the clinical literature is working to describe in more precise terms. The camps did not end when the wire came down. They continued, in modified form, in the bodies and relationships of the men who left them, and in the families those men subsequently built. The ex-prisoner organizations that formed across Australia, Britain, the United States, the Netherlands, and Canada in the post-war decades served multiple functions simultaneously. They were advocacy bodies, pressing for better pension provisions and official recognition. They were social communities, providing the company of men who shared a specific experiential history that could not be fully translated to outsiders. They were, in the absence of formal therapeutic services, informal spaces of collective processing. Places where the things that could not be said at home could be said among people who already knew them. The research that medical psychologists conducted by working with these organizations in the 1980s and 90s, gaining access to survivor populations who had not previously been formally studied, produced some of the foundational findings in the modern clinical understanding of chronic PTSD in elderly populations. The men of the ex-prisoner organizations contributed, without always knowing it, to a medical knowledge that would eventually benefit people who had experienced nothing remotely like what they had been through. The question of whether the silence that survivors maintained was damaging to them is addressed in the clinical literature with considerable, yes, in most cases, it was. Men who maintained the most complete silence about their captivity tended to show higher rates of the most severe symptom clusters. Men who were able to speak, even to a limited audience, even in partial and edited terms, showed somewhat better long-term psychological outcomes. This finding emerged too late to benefit most of the men it applied to. The generation of Pacific War POW survivors who lived into the 1980s and 90s when the research was being conducted and when the therapeutic infrastructure for addressing their specific condition was finally being developed, had spent 35 to 40 years managing without it. The knowledge that came too late is itself a form of loss that belongs in the accounting. The oral history and testimony projects that various national archives and memorial institutions launched from the 1980s onward. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, the Oral History Program at the Australian War Memorial, the Sound Archive at the Imperial War Museum, managed to capture a portion of what the silence had been protecting. Elderly men who had spent decades not speaking agreed, in the final years of their lives, to be recorded. The recordings that resulted are among the most valuable primary sources in the entire Pacific War prisoner archive, not because they are more accurate than the contemporary diaries and registers, but because they capture something the contemporary documents cannot: the quality of memory after decades, the way the experience had been metabolized, the specific details that had remained sharp while others had faded, and the particular emotional texture of a man in his 80s, looking back across the distance of his life, at the young man who had been inside that wire, that distance, and the courage required to cross it on record, is something the transcripts alone cannot convey. Chapter 16, The Memorial Landscape, How Nations Chose, What to Remember. The physical geography of Pacific War POW commemoration is one of the more uneven memorial landscapes in the entire body of Second World War memory. It is distributed across more than a dozen countries, maintained by a combination of national governments, international bodies, local communities, and private organizations, and marked by an inequality of resource and attention that broadly reflects the inequalities of political and economic power among the nations whose citizens are being commemorated. The most extensively maintained memorials are those administered by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the organization responsible for the graves and memorials of British and Commonwealth military dead from both world wars. The Commission currently maintains more than 23,000 separate burial sites and more than 200 memorials worldwide, including facilities in Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, and across the Pacific Island chain where the war was fought. The Yokohama War Cemetery, constructed by the Australian War Graves Group in the years immediately following the war, sits 9 kilometers west of the center of the city, in the Hodogaya ward, and contains 1,555 Commonwealth burials and commemorations from the Second World War, including 53 individuals who could not be identified. Among its most distinctive features is the Yokohama Cremation Memorial, a shrine housing an urn containing the ashes of 335 soldiers, sailors, and airmen from Commonwealth nations, the United States of America and the Netherlands, who died as prisoners of war in Japan and whose remains were recovered in cremated form. Their names, all but 51 of them, who were unidentified, are inscribed on the walls of the shrine. It is a very quiet memorial. It sits in a residential area of a city that has largely rebuilt over the landscape of the war. Most of the people who pass near it on an ordinary day are not thinking about what is inside it. The Kanchanaburi War Cemetery in Thailand, near the banks of the River Kwai, is among the most visited Pacific War memorial sites in the world, receiving large numbers of visitors each year from Australia, Britain, the Netherlands, and other countries with significant POW populations who worked on the Burma-Thailand Railway. The cemetery contains almost 7,000 graves. Allied prisoners who died during the railway's construction and who were reinterred there from scattered burial sites along the line after the war. The railway itself no longer runs along its original route, though portions of the original track and some of the bridge infrastructure survive as heritage sites. The bridge on the River Kwai, made famous by David Lean's 1957 film, continues to attract visitors who arrive with the film's imagery more fully formed in their minds than any knowledge of the actual history of the railway. The film, which is a brilliant cinematic achievement and a historically significant distortion of the documented record, has probably introduced more people to the existence of the Burma-Thailand Railway than any other single cultural artifact while simultaneously shaping popular understanding in ways that serious historians find persistently frustrating to work against. The Hellfire Pass Memorial in Thailand, the site of Konyu cutting, maintained by the Australian government through the Department of Veterans Affairs, represents a more recent and more historically specific form of commemoration than the large cemeteries. Established in 1998, the memorial includes a museum, a preserved section of the cutting itself, and a walking trail along the original railway route that allows visitors to experience, in a physically immediate way, the terrain through which the prisoners worked. The cutting is, perhaps, the most direct physical connection that currently exists between the contemporary world and the experience of the railway prisoners. A place where the work those men did with their hands is still visible in the rock, where the specific dimensions of the labour can be read in the landscape. Visitors who walk through it at night, when the memorial is occasionally opened for after-dark tours, report an experience of spatial and atmospheric immediacy that daylight does not provide in quite the same way. This is not an accident of the program design. It is a deliberate attempt to use the physical qualities of the site to produce a form of understanding that written or photographic accounts cannot fully replicate. The memorial landscape in Japan itself is complicated in ways that reflect the ongoing complexity of Japanese national engagement with the Pacific War. The Yokohama War Cemetery, as noted, provides for the remains of prisoners who died in Japan. Several former POW campsites in Japan have been marked with plaques or small memorials, in some cases organized by local citizens groups rather than by official government bodies. The POW Research Network Japan, a non-governmental organization established by Japanese citizens committed to documenting the prisoner of war experience, has done systematic work to identify campsites, preserve documentary evidence, and develop relationships with former prisoner communities and their descendants, conducting exchanges that have produced some of the most significant acts of direct, personal reconciliation in this history. These efforts represent a dimension of Japanese civil society engagement with the POW history that stands in distinct contrast to the official government position, which has been more cautious and more politically constrained in its acknowledgements. The question of official Japanese apology for Pacific War prisoner treatment has been a persistent subject of diplomatic tension across the decades. Since the war, with different allied nations reaching different accommodations at different times, Japan issued an apology specifically to Canadian prisoners of war in December of 2011, roughly 70 years after the fall of Hong Kong, at a ceremony in Tokyo that surviving Canadian former prisoners described as deeply meaningful, even as they acknowledged its belatedness. The apology was received by a 90-year-old survivor who had spent 4 years as a prisoner in Hong Kong and Japan, and who described it as an extremely important step, while noting that Japan had refused to give it for 70 years. The timing, when the survivor population was so reduced by age that only a handful of men remained alive to receive it, gave the gesture a quality of closing a door that was almost fully shut already. The survivors who might have most benefited from an earlier acknowledgement were largely gone. The descendants who witnessed the ceremony received it on behalf of people who were no longer present to receive it for themselves. The Indisch Monument in The Hague, dedicated in 1988, commemorates the Dutch civilians and military personnel who suffered in the former Dutch East Indies during the Japanese occupation. Its placement in the Netherlands reflects the post-colonial geography of that nation's relationship with the East Indies history a relationship complicated by the fact that the Indonesian government, for reasons rooted in the political legacy of the Dutch colonial period and the subsequent independence conflict, has not always welcomed Dutch commemoration activities on Indonesian soil. The separation between the place where the suffering occurred and the place where it is publicly commemorated, a separation imposed not by distance alone, but by the political aftermath of colonialism, is one of the more structurally interesting features of the Dutch East Indies memorial landscape. The people who suffered in Java and Sumatra are remembered in a park in The Hague, while the ground where the camps stood has been built over by a country that has its own different relationship with the same history. The Comfort Women Memorial landscape is a specific and particularly contested subset of Pacific War commemoration that extends into the present with unresolved political heat. Statues commemorating the women who were coerced into sexual servitude for the Imperial Japanese military, erected in South Korea, in the Philippines, in Australia, and in communities around the world, have been the subject of ongoing diplomatic dispute between Japan and the countries where they stand, with Japanese government officials repeatedly requesting their removal on the grounds that they misrepresent the historical record or violate the terms of various bilateral agreements. The women who were the subjects of this system and the descendants of those who died have maintained a sustained campaign for formal, unequivocal acknowledgement that has not been satisfied by the partial and repeatedly qualified statements that Japanese government spokespeople have offered. The Comfort Women Memorials are, in the broader landscape of Pacific War commemoration, the sites where the gap between the historical documentation and the official acknowledgement remains most visible and most contested. Chapter 17. The Historiographical Debate. What historians have argued and why it matters history is never finished. This is not a comfortable thought for people who prefer their records settled and their accounts closed, but it is one of the more important facts about the discipline. And the history of Japanese POW camps during the Pacific War is a particularly active site of ongoing scholarly argument. The debates that historians have been conducting about this subject since the 1970s involve questions of causation, intentionality, comparison, and moral framing that have direct implications for how nations understand their pasts and how individuals understand their experiences. These debates are not academic in the pejorative sense of that word. They are arguments about what happened, why it happened, who bears responsibility, and what standards we apply when we evaluate the conduct of a state and a military in circumstances of total war. The foundational debate concerns the nature of Japanese prisoner mistreatment, whether it was the product of deliberate policy, of institutional culture, of structural failure, or of individual cruelty operating inside a permissive environment. The position that commands the most support in the current scholarly consensus, though it is not unanimous, holds that no single explanatory framework is adequate and that the diversity of prisoner experience across 500 camps and nearly 4 years of war requires a multi-causal account. Gavin Dawes, whose 1994 work, Prisoners of the Japanese, drew on the testimony of hundreds of survivors across multiple nationalities, argued that what the camps shared was a systematic devaluation of prisoner life that made cruelty easy and compassion difficult, without there being a single central directive ordering specific abuses. The historian Michael Sturmer, writing in the Journal of Contemporary History, has examined the death toll specifically and argued that estimates have varied in ways that reflect both genuine uncertainty about the documentary record and the specific interpretive frameworks different scholars bring to the question, the comparative dimension of the debate. The question of how Japanese prisoner treatment compares with treatment of prisoners by other belligerents in the Second World War has been approached with increasing methodological sophistication in recent scholarship. The raw death rate comparison, 27% among Allied prisoners of Japan versus 4% among Allied prisoners of Germany and Italy, is a well-established statistical fact that is not in serious dispute. What is debated is the interpretation of that differential. Scholars who emphasize the structural and logistical factors, the vast geographic distances, the inadequate supply chains, the lack of planning for the prisoner population that Japan acquired, argue that much of the differential can be attributed to organizational failure rather than deliberate policy. Scholars who emphasize the institutional culture of the Japanese military, the Bushido Code's contempt for prisoners, the absence of any enforced accountability for individual acts of violence, argue that organizational failure is insufficient as an explanation, and that the cultural and institutional dimensions must be given independent weight. The most careful scholarship holds that both sets of factors were operative, and that the attempt to reduce the explanation to either one alone misrepresents the actual complexity. The question of Emperor Hirohito's personal responsibility is one of the most historiographically active sub-debates in the field, energized significantly by Herbert Bix's detailed study of the emperor's wartime role, published in 2000, which drew on Japanese language primary sources that had not previously been fully utilized in English language scholarship. Bix's argument that Hirohito was an active participant in wartime decision-making, who understood and approved the military campaigns that produced the prisoner abuse, was controversial when published and remains so. Japanese government and academic responses to Bix's work have ranged from substantive counter-arguments based on alternative interpretations of the same sources to more dismissive positions that have not engaged the primary source evidence with equivalent seriousness. The debate is not, in the scholarly literature, a closed question. The evidence is genuinely complex, and reasonable historians have reached genuinely different conclusions from it. The role of the Zaibatsu corporations in the prisoner labor system has generated a relatively recent body of scholarship that the earlier literature did not adequately address. Researchers working in Japanese corporate archives and in the records of post-war occupation economic investigations have documented the extent to which major industrial conglomerates, companies whose successor corporations are still significant in the contemporary Japanese economy, benefited directly from prisoner and forced labor during the war. The absence of corporate accountability in the Tokyo Trials framework has been identified as a significant gap, not only in the historical record, but in the post-war settlement that shaped the trajectory of Japanese capitalism. Some of this scholarship has supported legal claims brought by former prisoners against Japanese corporations in both Japanese and American courts, claims that have, with limited exceptions, been dismissed on jurisdictional or statute of limitations grounds, but that have contributed to a public record of corporate involvement that was not previously visible outside specialist research. The intersection of corporate history and war crimes accountability is one of the more active frontiers in contemporary scholarship on the Pacific War. The historiographical position of the Romusha, the Asian forced laborers who vastly outnumbered Allied prisoners on the Burma-Thailand Railway, and in other labor projects across the occupied territories, has been the subject of increasing critical attention from historians working in Southeast Asian and East Asian national scholarly traditions. The early post-war literature was written predominantly from Allied perspectives in Allied languages, drawing on Allied documentary sources. The Romusha experience was invisible in this literature, not because it was unimportant, but because it was undocumented in the forms that Western archival practice recognized. The development of Indonesian, Malaysian, and other Southeast Asian national historical scholarship in the decades since independence has gradually built a more substantial account of the Romusho experience, though the death rates involved, estimated at hundreds of thousands, mean that the documentary record will never be complete in the way that the Allied prisoner record, for all its gaps, approaches completeness. This asymmetry in the historical record is itself a subject of sustained critical reflection in current scholarship on memory, documentation, and the politics of historical visibility. The comfort women debate occupies a specific position in the historiographical landscape that distinguishes it from other Pacific War prisoner-related debates by its ongoing political dimensions. The scholarly consensus, established through extensive documentary research conducted by historians in South Korea, Japan, the United States, and elsewhere, is that the comfort women system involved systematic coercion of women from occupied territories, predominantly Korean and Chinese, into sexual servitude for Japanese military personnel, and that the scale of the system and the coercive mechanisms involved make it a war crime of serious magnitude. This consensus has been contested by Japanese nationalist scholars and politicians, who have argued, with varying degrees of acknowledgement of the evidence, that the system was voluntary, or that the evidence of coercion has been exaggerated. The debate between these positions is not, in the view of most specialists in the field, a genuine scholarly controversy. The evidence for systematic coercion is extensive and well documented. It is a political controversy that has been conducted in scholarly language, which is a different thing, and the distinction matters for how the debate is reported and received by non-specialist audiences. The question of Japanese national memory and the progress of historical reckoning within Japan is addressed in the scholarship with a nuance that popular accounts sometimes flatten into a binary of acknowledgement versus denial. The reality is substantially more complex. Japan has a large and serious body of academic and journalistic scholarship on the Pacific War that engages with the documented record honestly and rigorously. It also has political institutions and cultural spaces in which nationalist interpretations that contradict this scholarship are given official or semi-official sanction. The tension between these two dimensions of Japanese historical culture has been a feature of Japanese political life since the early 1960s, when the first serious scholarly reassessments of the war began to appear, and it has not resolved in any terminal direction in the 80 years since the war ended. The schools of thought are both still active, still in conflict, and still influencing the official positions that the Japanese government takes in the diplomatic conversations about apology, about textbooks, about memorials that surround this history. What this means for the non-Japanese observer is that the simplest characterizations of Japan's response to the war are almost certainly wrong, and that the actual situation requires more patience and more qualification than the compressed versions that political discourse makes available. The ongoing nature of these debates is not evidence of historical failure. It is evidence of historical health. of a subject that continues to attract serious researchers, to generate new documentary discoveries, and to matter sufficiently to the people engaged with it that the arguments remain sharp. The men and women who were inside the camps are almost entirely gone now. The youngest Allied prisoner of the Pacific War would be in his late 90s or older, and the survivor population that once numbered in the tens of thousands has been reduced by the passage of time to a handful of individuals in very advanced age. As the living witnesses leave the record, the burden shifts more fully to the documents. The diaries, the registers, the trial transcripts, the medical records, the architectural remains. And to the historians, family members, and communities who choose to engage with those documents. The debates are, in a real sense, the continuation of the obligation that the evidence creates. They are the form that responsibility takes, when the people to whom the responsibility is most directly owed are gone. Chapter 18, The Weight of Memory. What this history means now. Every history eventually arrives at this question, whether the historian writing it acknowledges the question explicitly or leaves it implied in the final sentence of the final chapter. What does this mean now? Why does it matter, at a distance of 80 years, to spend hours with the history of men and women in camps that no longer exist, run by an empire that no longer exists, in a world that has been restructured so completely by the intervening decades that the specific landscape of 1942, the colonial geography, the specific power arrangements, the particular forms of state violence, has been largely replaced by arrangements that are different, if not in all cases better. The question deserves a serious answer rather than a reflexive appeal to the importance of memory as a value in itself. The most immediate answer is the simplest one. There are people alive in the world today who are directly connected to this history. The children and grandchildren of Pacific War prisoners are present in every country that was involved in that conflict. Some of them are carrying intergenerational psychological burdens whose origins in the camps they may not have fully identified. Some of them are engaged in active research into their family history, seeking the specific details about parents and grandparents that the post-war silence prevented them from receiving directly. Some of them have spent their adult lives advocating for recognition, apology, reparation, or simply accurate historical accounting on behalf of people they loved. For all of these individuals, this is not a completed history. It is an ongoing one, and the accuracy and completeness of the public record has direct practical meaning for their own understanding of who they are and where they come from. The second answer concerns what the history reveals about systems, about the specific mechanisms through which states, armies, and bureaucracies create conditions under which mass suffering becomes possible without anyone individual necessarily ordering it. The Pacific War camp system was not primarily the product of monsters, though it contained some. It was primarily the product of a set of institutional structures, a military code that devalued enemy prisoners, a bureaucratic system that left individual commandants with unchecked authority, an industrial economy that found prisoner labor convenient and had no incentive to question the conditions under which it was provided, and a chain of command that treated accountability as a problem to be avoided rather than a value to be maintained. These structural features are not unique to Imperial Japan. They are recognizable in the institutional analysis of other historical atrocities and in the analysis of institutional failures in non-war contexts as well. The specific history of the camps teaches this structural lesson with particular force precisely because it is so well documented. because the human cost is so precisely recorded, and because the gap between the institutional language used to describe what was happening and the human reality of what was actually happening is so legible in the archive. The third answer concerns the specific obligation of memory toward the Romusha, the Asian forced laborers whose deaths are estimated in the hundreds of thousands and whose individual stories are almost entirely absent from the public record. The corrective work that scholars in Southeast and East Asia have been doing over the past several decades. Recovering what can be recovered, acknowledging the limitations of what cannot, is a project that deserves more support and more attention from the English language historical community than it has typically received. The story of the Pacific War camps, told primarily from the perspective of Allied prisoners, is not a false story, but it is an incomplete one, and the incompleteness is not random. It reflects the specific distribution of literacy, institutional resources, and historical visibility that existed in 1942, and that shaped which experiences were recorded, preserved, served, and subsequently amplified. To tell the story more completely is to restore to it the full weight of what actually happened, not to diminish the Allied prisoner experience, but to insist that it was not the only experience that mattered. The survivors who are still alive, very few now, in extreme old age, are in the position of last witnesses to a history that will, within a small number of years, exist entirely in the secondary record. The transition from living memory to archived memory is one that every historical event must eventually make, and it is never a smooth or lossless transition. Things are lost in it. The specific quality of voice, the unguarded moment of recognition between people who shared an experience, the knowledge that sits in a body and cannot fully transfer into a document. What can be preserved? The diaries, the testimonies, the medical records, the camp registers, the oral history recordings, is extensive by historical standards and more comprehensive than the equivalent record for most comparably large-scale human experiences. The archival infrastructure is there. The obligation is to use it and to make sure that the people who want to use it in the future can find it without the accidental barriers that institutional indifference sometimes builds around archives it no longer considers pressing. The memorial dimension of this history, the physical sites, the cemeteries, the museums, faces a specific challenge in the present moment that has nothing to do with political controversy and everything to do with geography and generational change. The cemeteries in Thailand, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and elsewhere were built and are maintained for visitors who have a personal or national connection to the people buried there. As that connection becomes more generational, from children to grandchildren to great-grandchildren, the immediacy of the personal motivation for visiting changes. What was a journey to the grave of a parent becomes a journey to the grave of an ancestor who is known primarily through family, story, and documentary record. The institutions that maintain these sites are aware of this generational transition and are, to varying degrees, developing educational programming and interpretive frameworks intended to sustain visitor engagement as the direct personal connections thin. Whether those frameworks will be adequate to the task is a question that the next generation of memorial management will answer through practice rather than prediction. The question of reconciliation, of whether formal processes of acknowledgement and apology between Japan and the countries whose citizens suffered in its camps have achieved what they set out to achieve, is one that can only be answered from the perspective of those who were most directly affected. The survivor who told a journalist in 2011 that Japan's apology to Canadian POWs was extremely important while noting that it had been refused for 70 years was expressing two things simultaneously: genuine appreciation for an acknowledgement long withheld, and a grief that no acknowledgement, however formally correct, could fully address. The apology came to a 90-year-old man who had carried its absence for the majority of his life. What it could do for him at that point was different from what it could have done for him at 40 or 50 or 60. Reconciliation processes that arrive at the end of a life rather than at some point within its arc are doing something, but what they are doing is different from what might have been done earlier, and the difference is worth acknowledging without using it to diminish what was actually achieved. The schools that teach this history, where they teach it, which is not everywhere and not with equal depth in any place, face the challenge of presenting material that is both historically specific and structurally general in ways that serve their different pedagogical purposes. The specific history of the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the Hell Ships, and the civilian internment camps is worth knowing in its particular details, because the details are the history, the specific names, the specific dates, the specific documented decisions that produced specific consequences. But the structural lessons about institutional power, about the mechanisms of dehumanization, about the conditions under which ordinary people in positions of authority over other people cause mass harm, are transferable in ways that the specific history points toward. Good teaching about this subject does both. It insists on the specific, irreducible facts of what happened to specific people in specific places, and it asks students to think about what those facts reveal about the structures that made them possible. The night is late, and the history has been long. We have traveled from the structural origins of Imperial Japan's military culture through the fall of Bataan and Singapore along the Burma Railway and across the Hell Ships into the camps of the Dutch East Indies and the coal mines of Japan, through the specific horror of Sandakan and the legal drama of the Tokyo trials, through the long silence of survivors and the contested landscape of memorials and historiographical debate, and finally to this question of what all of it means. Now, in the world, the people in these camps helped to produce through their endurance and their dying. The answer is not a tidy one. It is not the kind of answer that resolves into a single sentence and allows the mind to close cleanly around it. This history asks to be held open, to be returned to, in the same way that the survivors found themselves returning to it in their sleep, not because returning is comfortable, but because the obligation of honest attention does not expire when the immediate emergency is over. The camps are gone, the wire is down. The men and women who were inside them have almost all made the final journey from their captivity into the record. What remains is the record and what we do with it. That part is still happening. That part, to whatever degree this documentary has helped with it, has no ending date.